So here we are in building that George designed, but he didn't build it. And that's because he got so busy. He was building he had built the shop, he built the house, but later as things developed, he was too busy. So he had to have collaboration. And he was very particular about who he collaborated with. He wasn't gonna just look for contractors who gave low bids. But the man who built the building built most of the buildings on the property, and nobody knows who he is. Robert Lovett was his name, and he was from a Quaker heritage, grew up on a farm deeded to his family by William Penn. And the Nakashimas, when they first came to Bucks County, through the intercession of the Raymonds, who said they would sponsor them, and then the government said they could leave the internment camp. Until the war was over, they were obliged to stay on Raymond Farm. The question is, when the war was over, why didn't the Nakashimas go back to the West Coast, where their families were, where their roots were, where the Japanese American community was very strong? Why stay here? And when you visit the farm, the answer starts to become quite clear. Because George had time on his hands, and he was starting his woodworking in the milk house, just a little shed between the house and the barn. And it's not much of a stretch of the imagination, and reading his writings, you can tell how he started to love that place and love the area around it. He would come out and look at that wall of the barn, and he wrote about what an effect it had on him, imagining the people who built it and how they lived there. And in his writings, he said that it made such an impact on him that he wanted to live here and live in that way and build in that way. So you could say that George and Bob were drawn together by this love of the Quaker building heritage. And Bob found someone who gave him the opportunity to work in the way his ancestors had worked. And George found a man able to build in the Quaker tradition he admired. And as Lauren mentioned, it was my great good fortune when I first arrived here to be able to work closely with George and Bob on the reception house, the last building that George put up on the property. And it was quite an experience for me because I had just started, and Bob was in his 60s at that point, so he said, George, is it possible that I could have a permanent helper rather than someone just coming out from the shop and holding the end of a board? And he said, well, we've got this kid here, he's not too experienced, he's young, he's strong. he's yours. For 2.5 years, we worked on the building, and it was an experience because a lot of the materials we garnered from the woods, we had to shop. But George and Bob had worked so closely together that there was no need of any drawings. Just be hand sketches. What did we do? Oh, we did it this way. We'll do it a little differently here. Well, what do we do next, George? Well, I'll tell you anything there too. And again, this is George's, with the trees as teachers. It's George wanted them to live like a tree and live organically and just grow as the moment required. So here were two souls, their bodies synchronized, their minds in union, and hearts devoted, involved in an activity of raising a building from a place sacred to them, growing like a tree. They were working with souls in communion as preservationists, preserving the integrity of a tradition infused in the building, making the transcendent immanent in every aspect of the work, creating a place for the spirit to manifest.
Thank you, John. So, I grew up here. I was born in Seattle, Washington, and then we were incarcerated on the Idaho Desert. And then we were sponsored by the Antonin and me Raymond to work on the farm here. So that was our first home in Bucks County, in that old farmhouse down the hill. And then after the war was over, we rented a little cottage down the road. Oh, and this is, I think I have pictures of those. Oh, these are pictures from the internment at the barracks there. My aunt and uncle are there on the left-hand side, and my grandfather's there with my mother on the right-hand photo. But that's from the camp in Minnesota. That was my first home. And then this is, there are two photos from Raymond Farm when we were there. It was a little bigger. And that was the side of the barn that John was just talking about. And I'm there next to where the cows lived. And that was my second home in Mexico. And this is our third home. It was down the road on Acaton Road. It's still there. There's an oak stone house. And there was, I think, the fireplace and a wood coal stove and the only heat we had. And in the photograph, my mother's father and her sister are also with us at the time. They had been in camp with us, and then somehow or other they were doing other things. My maternal grandfather was teaching at University of Pennsylvania. And then Dad found this property. I think this is this property in its younger days when the trees were much smaller. And he liked it because it was a south-facing slope. And didn't have money to buy it. So he asked if the man who owned it would let him have enough property, like 3 acres, to pitch a tent on and to build his workshop, which was the first building on the property. So that's what happened. We lived in a tent, and I don't think I have any pictures of the tent. But then he started building the house, and these are the early pictures of the house. He built it literally with his own 2 hands. I remember him digging the foundation and taking up stones from the property, and then I also remember when we were driving along, we had an old Ford that had holes in the floor. He'd stop it by the side of the road, pick up a road by the side of the road and throw it in the back of the car. So that's how that first wall got built. And if you go to see it, you can tell that he was not a very skilled mason. He did his best, and he also did the plumbing and the electric, which later had to be redone. He didn't have enough money for any insulation, and he poured the concrete tiles himself for the roof. And this is when the building was under construction. When we were still living in a tent, we had picnics and parties in what was there of the house, which wasn't a whole lot. And I remember when the house was first built, there was a big beam that he borrowed. He must have bought it from an old farm. Or an old barn or something. So there's one big beam in the center of the living room there, and I used to have a rope swing on there. Dad had installed a rope swing for me before the floor was in. I remember that was my favorite thing to do, was go swing on the swing over the empty floor joist. And I wanted to do that one day, and I tripped and fell on a nail that was sticking out of one of the floor joists. I remember very distinctly. I was bleeding all over the place, but that was one of my vivid memories of the house. But anyway, we both survived. And this is a picture of some of the joinery that Dad did. I think he must have learned it when he was in Japan. And that is a picture of the southern facade of that house. The entire south wall had a 3-foot porch, a sun porch, all the way along on the south side when I was growing up. Later on, he expanded and he had to change the roof. Those concrete roof tiles were starting to leak so much. I remember going over there in the mid-'80s and asking my mother and dad, who were just kind of living with the leaks. They said, I said, why come there's pots and pans all over the house? And they said, there's too many leaks. And then they finally decided to do something, put on a new roof. So they put a scissors truss and a cedar-shaped roof over it and expanded the building out 3 feet. And that was in the mid-'80s, I believe. Bill knows all the...
Yes. Correct.
He's done all the research, bless his heart. And so this is a model. It was my dollhouse. But it was the model of the house. And he did it at a scale where I could buy these little plastic dollhouse furniture and put my dolls inside of it. But I didn't realize it at the time that it was actually a model of the house. And this is the west end of the house, where they have those little sliding doors to the right of the stone wall. Are the back of the fireplace. And I remember we used to, I guess we didn't finish the front half part of the house yet, so there wasn't a front door, and we used to go in that door by the fireplace. And later on that became where we threw the wood in for the fireplace, but I remember going in and out of those doors. That was probably the door I went into when I fell and cut my hip. And this is the other end. This is the east end of the house, which faces the showroom now. It was my parents' bedroom, and then later became my brother's bedroom after they passed away. And this is the front entrance, which I think got revised a little bit. The slanting roof to the end, to the left of the entrance, was the corrugated transite roof over the cistern. We didn't have money to drill a well, so we collected rainwater, and that was the cistern. The cistern is still there. I don't know what's in it. But the roof is corrugated transite because that was a cheap way. And you can see the concrete tiles on the roof in that photograph. And this is the back bedroom. I love the details on the overhang over the windows on the back bedroom. I don't know if that's typically Japanese or what it is, but it was an interesting way to put a ease over the window. And these are pictures of the house indeed, many, many years ago. This is what eventually became what was called the milk house table, because it was built, the design was conceived and developed while we were at the Raymond Farm, and Dad was working in the milk house at Raymond Farm to make his furniture. And that's one picture of it on the left, and then there's one with a different face. And then there's a picture of us looking out the glass windows from the living room in the house when I was little. You can see the trees are much smaller than. And this is the south porch. When I was growing up, that entire wall was sliding glass doors with that lovely porch in front of it. And this is an interior shot. The kitchen looks pretty much the way it does still to this day. The living room has changed a bit, but that's about 1950 or so. And that's the a close-up of the kitchen. We have an antique dough bowl, Pennsylvania dough bowl, used for salad, and various different kinds of baskets, Japanese baskets and different things. And that's my bedroom, which still has those murals on it, and the porch. A close-up of the mural. I think I did it in 2 stages. If you go to the house and ask Laura nicely, she will take you in the back. And that was my bedroom when I was growing up, and I was allowed to paint on the doors. So it's in several different stages. The one I'm pointing to is a later stage. My brother was born in 1954, so that was, I think, one of the later stages. I have a little picture of him on a rocking horse there. And this is my brother when he was newborn on the left. Very curious object to have in the house. And there he is, a little bit bigger on the right, and in that nice sunny porch. There he is, a little bit bigger. Kevin got all kind of attention. He's obviously in a basket there on the left, and he's on my lap there on the right. But I remember we had another picture on the porch. I couldn't find the picture, but there's one picture. He was in a I guess it was a coffee box or something, and he's playing happily. And we took his picture, and the label on the box said "chock full of nuts." There he is on rocking horse that Dad designed for him. We still have that in the front room of the house for everybody to enjoy. And there's Kevin in his samurai outfit in a later age in the living room. And when Kevin was born, Dad built a second, or I guess it's a third bedroom to the south for me. So this was my bedroom. When after Kevin was born, he had a bedroom of my own. I think it's the biggest room in the house, and it was very nice. Had a lot of sunlight from the south, and later became my brother's bedroom after I got closed. It's a picture of us at Christmas time around that fireplace. The fireplace there was the only source of heat when we first moved into the house. And it's built kind of like a Franklin stove, and it's got a concrete housing, so it did retain heat more than a regular fireplace. But Mom said it built up the fire at night, it'd be cold by morning, but that was the only heat we had in the beginning. And there's some later photographs of Mother and Dad and Kevin in the dining room, and then that's the living room off to the right. In an earlier stage, you can see that it has a trestle table with Mira chairs around it, and later on they graduated to Conway chairs and a fancier table. And I love this round window on the garage. The garage was built in the 50s, I believe, when we got our first real car, a new car. I think we've been using used cars since when we got a new car, so we go to the garage put a moon window on it. This is the walkway that goes from the house to the showroom. Dad believed in an integrated life, that you should not separate your place of work from your living place. And that was what he learned at the ashram in India. So the house was always right next to the shop. And so the house is on the left there, garage is down the pathway, and then the other end of the pathway is the showroom, which was built in 1954 when my brother was born. And it has corrugated transite group. And it's still in full use. We're redoing the heating system now. University of Pennsylvania did a campus-wide study of our energy usage and wanted us to, switch over to a more, the less carbon footprint heating systems. So we're doing it little by little. This building has already been renovated, and we're working on the family house as we speak. But it takes a lot of time and money, so we're doing it little by little. These are the first hyperbolic paraboloids built on the property. In the 1950s, the new technology of thin warp shell construction came out. Dad was fascinated. Dad, by the way, went to Harvard for 2 weeks in graduate school and couldn't stand it. He switched to MIT because MIT was better at engineering and construction. So he was when the technology of hyperbolic paraboloid shells came out in the 50s. He was fascinated. He really wanted to build some of his own. So these are the two first hyperbolic paraboloids on the property. They just house lumber, and then this is go ahead. Thank you. Sorry. And this is another kind of shell. It's a conoidal shell. It's round at one end and flat at the other. And in this photograph, you can't see, but right next to it is kind of a mock-up of the concrete version it's smaller and has plywood. So he was constantly fascinated by thin shell construction like this building we're in now. And this is another shell built in 1960. It's a pool house, and it's a conoidal shell, but it's supported on the two side walls rather than the front and the back. Now this is the building we're in, another hyperbolic paraboloid shell. And he built this building in honor of his good friend Ben Shawn, the painter, because Ben said he didn't have a gallery for himself. So he intended this as a gallery for Ben. And so he built it, and Ben came by when it was under construction. He says, "Oh, George, that's a perfect wall for a mosaic." So he designed a mosaic for it. Unfortunately, the building opened in 1967. And Ben passed away in '69, so he did not get to see this mosaic realized and installed. We did it in 1971 in his memory, and we sent the maquette over to Chartres, France, to a mosaicist that Ben had worked with before, and he did these in 8 pounds and shipped them over. And they've been there ever since. We're very fortunate to have an abstract Ben Shawn mosaic on our wall here. This is the last building that my dad built. It has a scissors truss roof. We're really grateful. I mean, it's an old building, and it's starting to deteriorate, and there are all kinds of things that need to be fixed and maintained, and we need to do a new heating system. But we're really grateful that University of Pennsylvania has done all their research. We now have a complete set of drawings. Dad never did drawings for any of the buildings on the property. I don't know how he got it through zoning and through, but it was in 1975. Everything was built before 1975 when things got a little stricter in Bucks County. But we're really grateful to University of Pennsylvania for helping generate all this history and all these drawings. And they will tell you more about how they did that. But that's it from me. Thank you very much, everybody.
Hello, everybody. I'm John DeFazio. I'm here representing the Raymond Farm Center, the story of Anthony and Noemi Raymond's farmhouse, which, first of all, I want to thank John for such a beautiful introduction to the day. The legacy of the Raymonds both lies here in the United States, but mostly in Japan. So this presentation I'm going to do, I'm sure all of you are familiar with George Nakashima and Mira's work and the woodworkers' work. But I'm using this kind of opportunity to introduce you to the Raymonds, because I believe a lot of you don't know, and we keep on flying these names around like everybody knows what's going on, and a deep history of George and his relationship to the Raymonds, which have their own remarkable story. But first I want to thank Lauren. Everybody should thank Lauren for putting this together. the Nakashimas have collaborated on every one of them, and literally it put us on the map by having our name associated with the legacy of the Nakashima. So I'm looking forward to seeing most of you, if possible, tomorrow at the Raymond Farm, in tomorrow's tour, and you'll see firsthand a lot of what I'm showing you here now. So this is the Raymond Farmhouse. Pretty much, I think this is a Charlotte Raymond photograph from about 5 or 6 years ago. So this is the Raymond Farm as it is today, pretty much as you're going to be seeing it in the coming day. Next, please. So the story of Anthony and Noemi Raymond, I got involved. First of all, I'm an architect and I'm a teacher as well as a co-director with Charlotte Raymond, one of these 6 grandchildren of Anthony and Noemi. And Charlotte really, unfortunately, couldn't be here. She's away attending a family memorial on the West Coast. And a lot of this, the existence of the Raymond Farm, although I'm a co-creator and a co-director with her, really is Charlotte's. Charlotte and I really started an association 20 years ago, even though we're just existing 10 years. And it's also through the grace of Bill, who you'll be seeing talking next, making these introductions back then some 20 years ago and getting me involved. But once you meet Charlotte, you realize you're part of a vortex of things. And kind of, there's a lots to be done, and she's kind of, she maintains a farmer's attitude. Okay, very much, here's a meal, this is what we need done, and kind of jumps into it. So a lot of this is really reflect, when I talk about the Raymond Farm Center, Charlotte Raymond is really the heart and soul of that whole project, of what we created there. Anthony and Noemi were actually immigrants from the United States, which I think is an important point to make. Both born in Europe. Noemi Pernison was born in the section of Switzerland and at the Swiss border, actually in Caen, France, but she was from Swiss parentage. She'd come to the United States when she's 12 years old. Antonin was born in a small town called Kladno outside of Prague, now the Czech Republic. Back then it was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Next slide. And Antonin was trained as an architect. He was always very artistic, but he also was very pragmatic. It was a kind of rough childhood. He had lost his mother when he was very young, and his father struggled pretty much in the years after that. But he knew he wanted to have a pragmatic education. He studied architecture at the Polytechnic Institute. And these are some of the examples of the teachers that he had. But in 1913, he comes to the United States because he had seen the work of Frank Lloyd Wright published in his, and these very teachers of those work told him, if you want to work on things that are avant-garde like that, you need to be in the United States working. So he came to New York in 1913, and he would work on the tallest building in the world, Cass Gilbert's very beautiful Woolworth building, which was under construction when he first arrived, but he actually become part of the team that helped finish it. It was being fast-tracked, and the work was going up, and he would work on that project. But later on, he got very frustrated with the work of Cass Gilbert, which I'll outline more tomorrow's tour. And he would study painting. And he went back, first he was doing night school here in New York, and then he went to Italy to do a kind of study abroad program one summer. Unfortunately, while he was there, the World War I was just about to break out. We're now into 1914. Next slide, please. And actually, on his way back, he would meet a woman, Noemi Pernison, who will be shortly after this meeting become his wife. Now, Noemi was extremely gifted artistically. Her parents, her stepfather, her mother's second marriage would bring her to New York when she's 12 years old. She would go to the Horace Mann School, and then she would go on to Columbia University to study art and art training, to be an art teacher. She studied under a wonderful teacher, Arthur Wesley Dow, and upon graduation, she actually started her own graphics company, and she would be doing illustrations for the Saturday Evening Post, for the New York Herald. She would do political cartoons, and she would even do branding for companies, doing all their graphics, even designing some of the products, in this case, paper cups. She was designing paper cup patterns that you would have. Next slide. Skipping forward, Anthony had quit his job at Cass Gilbert, and Noemi actually, through her connections through Arthur Wesley Dow's circles, and her roommate, literally, as she had at Columbia University, had a contact with Frank Lloyd Wright. She actually writes Frank Lloyd Wright, saying, Mr. Wright, my husband Anthony, he's an architect, he worked on for Cass Gilbert. He loves your work. We'd love to come out and work for you. I studied under Arthur Wesley Dow. And Wright said, sure, come on in. This is in 1915, 1914, 1915, forward. And eventually, after another series of chapters in the Raymond's life, Wright would invite them again after World War I is concluded to come help finish the Imperial Hotel in Japan. And this is the beginning of the Raymond's legacy in Japan. The Imperial Hotel was extremely important in Wright's career. It was the largest building up to that point. Antonin would become the project architect on it, and Noemi would be helping to build the interiors. Next slide. So they were hired to create a Western-style new modern hotel, which would attract Westerners to Tokyo, but Wright did this amazing fusion between Asian design and American design at this time. Move to the next slides. So these are some of the interiors that Noemi would be working on. And next slide, please. And the Raymonds themselves would start their own practice in Tokyo. I'll go over the details why they probably started their practice in 1920 before they even finished working with Frank Lloyd Wright. These are some examples of their work done in a kind of a Wrightian vein. This is very early on in their careers. But eventually they'll form their own company after parting with Wright, the American Architects and Engineer Company. Next slide, please. When they did that, almost simultaneously to the opening of the Imperial Hotel, there was a great Kanto earthquake, which you could see here, 100,000 or more people perished in this earthquake. But next slide, please. The Imperial Hotel famously survives, and the Raymonds are there in Japan. Frank Lloyd Wright's already back in the United States. He doesn't even know if the building survived or not. But the Raymonds are there, and Anthony in particular is interviewed by the local magazines and newspapers. Why does the Imperial Hotel withstand these earthquakes? And he knew all the principles that Frank Lloyd Wright used to make an earthquake-proof, fireproof building. And this would kind of supercharge their careers over the next 18 years as they are there to establish what, in hindsight, became the beginning of modern architecture in Japan. Next slide, please. So they would do a whole series of fireproof buildings during this period of time, kind of building upon their expertise. Also, Japan at this time wanted to westernize a great deal at this time. Next slide, please. And the most important of these early projects would be the Women's Christian College of Tokyo, which was not just one building, but was a whole series of 48 buildings, which gave them the kind of regularity to their office over the next course of the 18 years. And I'll talk more about this tomorrow. So then, from the monies that they have now, they actually had lost their house in the Great Earthquake. They had a traditional Japanese house that burnt down, and their replacement house, the Rezanaka house, Anthony really was the first time he could demonstrate what he could do in his own modern thinking of architecture. And this is an extremely early reinforced concrete house. And a modern house, one of the first in Japan, actually one of the first in the world that's being executed truly in concrete. This is 1924. Noemi would do all the interiors. And as you can imagine, in 1923, 1924, there are no catalogs. There's no factory made. There's no design within reach. There's no furniture yet. There's nothing. So Noemi acts like she's a one-person factory. She is incredibly gifted. The fact, and I'll go into it tomorrow a little bit about how Frank Lloyd Wright admired her work and always was referring to her as a co-equal all from the very beginning. So anyway, next slide, please. So over the next 18 years, the Raymonds will be pioneering modern architecture in Japan. And you can see how quickly they evolved from kind of making Frank Lloyd Wright type buildings. And as you imagine, the clients that would be hiring, this person works for Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright is the greatest architect in America. I want a house just like Frank Lloyd Wright. So the very first houses were like that. And that Noemi's assistants, Anthony actually goes beyond that because he was very conservative in a way himself. And they start pioneering these amazing series of 150 executed projects and maybe an additional 150, 200 more projects that were unexecuted in this first 18-year period. Next slide, please. And by this time, in the beginning, it was just Americans and Europeans working in a very small office. They started with like 6 architects and engineers in the very beginning. But by the 1930s, they're attracting, because of the publication of their work, they're attracting the most avant-garde young architects in Japan. And one of those people who will eventually work there in office, this is a picture of the Raymond offices in 1934. And what's very interesting to us in particular, you might recognize this gentleman right here, is a recent MIT graduate and also had recently toured through Europe, finishing up his studies there before arriving in Japan. 1934, he would become, join the offices of Anthony and Noemi, one of his first full-time modern jobs. I think he actually worked under Robert Moses at one point, working on parts in New York before this. But here he is arriving. And also, probably very interesting to all of you is Junzo Yoshimura. Junzo is
Lower right.
lower right. And all of you familiar with Shofuso, the Japanese housing garden in Philadelphia. Junzo also would be one of the great proteges of the Raymonds. And actually there's Miyakawa here and a whole group of people that would be part of the mid-century modern in Japan. So the Raymonds truly had a teaching practice, an atelier, where you actually are there to work, study side by side. And they saw it as collaboration. So it's almost like a hothouse of ideas. Miyakawa himself went from Corbusier's office to come work for the Raymonds because the Raymonds were on the map internationally as pioneering work. So you can see why I get excited about being part of this whole Raymond story. It's just a remarkable, remarkable story. Next slide, please. So what the Raymonds did was Tokyo in the summer is very much like Philadelphia in the summer, if you want to get out. Very hot, very humid, so they sought to have a country house and they created a country summer studio. This is the first summer studio in Koreasawa, which is controversial in its own right. That's another story. Next slide, please. And then, and also in Kurosawa was the first project that George Nakashima would really be the project architect in St. Paul's, a very small, beautiful chapel, which is kind of a little cultural landmark within Japan. It's almost impossible to get there on a Sunday because every wedding Sunday is booked. It's kind of a wonderfully charming space. Let's see the next slide, the interior. And it's also very important in George's own story when he tells the story. He says this is when he kind of realizes and starts realizing the importance of furniture and furniture as an art form. This chair here, which is featured within this, is really what George says he starts his career. Noemi was designing all the furniture and he was collaborating. Noemi was a collaborator, not, do it this way. So this is what George credits in his own biography in Soul of a Tree as the beginning of his career making furniture. So the Raymonds are right there with almost George beginning to find his own voice. Next slide, please. Well, even more important in finding his own voice is this project, which Mira had mentioned. This is called Khan in India, the first modern building in India, the first reinforced concrete building in India. And George Nakashima was the project architect. And you can see the difference in scale, literally just a year apart between St. Paul's and this project. This was a major project for the Raymonds, as well as a major project for George. And you might notice as you look around at the details, George's concrete work is exquisite as well as his woodwork. Extremely experimental and wonderful to look at. Well, George, the Raymonds George would actually go there and scout out the site before the Raymonds were even there, came back, made a report. They did the preliminary designs in Japan before returning back to India to start to execute the project. They built this being the first concrete building in India, they literally had to make a mock-up so everybody understand what a reinforced concrete building would be like. George would be project managing and managing all the materials. Mira tells a wonderful story of George talking about they were delivering materials and all the rebar was left on the beach like spaghetti. But anyways, and this would be a labor of love, particularly for George. The Raymonds would have, after 6 months of this preliminary design, they left George there to finish and execute the project. And you can imagine this is a concrete building. And for architects in the audience, a concrete building really means a formwork building, right? You're making the negative of what's going to be there. And you can imagine when you're having your formwork supervised by George Nakashima. And this is one of the reasons why it's one of the most superb buildings of its generation. 2 decades before Corbusier's building in this manner. It's really, truly a remarkable building, which next year it'll be the 100th anniversary of it, 50, whatever. 19, it's 19, anyway, it's an anniversary coming up, and we'll do a special symposium talking about this in the coming years as part of that celebration. Next slide, please. It's just an extraordinary building, and also one of the earliest example of a sustainable design, passively sustainable modern building. So this is not cutting edge just for the Raymonds or for George, but for architecture. And this is another thing which always attracted me to the Raymonds work. The principles they designed to are principles we hope architects hold to today. Not just for the beauty of it, not for just the use of natural materials or light, or even the aesthetics of it, but the fact that they're really grounded in the reality of building in a place, building in a climate, building that every aspect of it is kind of poetic. Not just what it looks like, but how it really is, right down to the very bones of the essence of it. What's inside of it is in harmony with where it is. Next slide. Unfortunately, this is all happening in 1938, and the world is going to war, and the Raymonds have to leave Japan. Tokyo, as they try to make their way back to Tokyo, they only get as far as Shanghai, and Japan starts the second war with China, and they have to go back to India, then eventually back to the United States. And this is the passport of their coming with their son, young son, Claude, in the middle there, as they're going through Versailles. They would visit Antonin's remaining family in Kladno. Unfortunately, they're all perished in the war. His father was Jewish, and his father and sister perished in the camps, and we don't know exactly how his brothers perished, but he thinks that they were, the family story is that they were some part of the resistance at that time. Move forward. As they come back to the United States, they patched things up with Frank earlier. They had a kind of falling out, which I'll explain better tomorrow. And really what Anthony wanted to do was to see what Frank Lloyd was doing with this new school, this Taliesin Fellowship, where Frank Lloyd Wright came up, and his whole team came up with this wonderful idea. We could have students come, pay us, and then they could do the work for us. And so the Raymonds said, we could do that. We're kind of teaching at Taliesin. So, and these are images of Wright and Taliesin at that time, and I could talk about that more tomorrow. Next slide, please. And the Raymonds also had published 2 books by this time. This is the second book, 1938, and this is a very important book, Architectural Details, which detailed all their work for this 18 years. And also was a document, I think it was when John was doing his beautiful introduction, he was talking about how you would go from one detail to the next. Okay, we'll do it kind of like this next. And the Raymonds kind of worked like that. They were working directly with the craftsmen. And this book is not just a projection of like, this is how we detail, this is why we're so wonderful. It's more like, this is what we came up with in the shop and within our group working. In fact, you could see in the title pages, Antonin and Noemi's signatures, and then signatures of all the other people in the office in Japanese at that time. So this is all of us working together. It shows this collaborative idea, this atelier idea. A lot of these illustrations that are contained in here are George's drawings. Mira said George didn't do much drawings. He didn't have to do much drawings because he was working on his own property. He was doing his own thing. We're not going to ask the building official very much. But on these, George had a beautiful hand, and you could see that he was a very, very gifted architect. And I think if Antonin had one disappointment in George, is that he didn't build more architecture. He knew George's incredible talent. Anyway, so the illustrations that you see here would be from the Raymond offices, but also George probably had a major hand in a lot of these images contained in that book. We have a facsimile of it. So the Raymonds wanted to create something equivalent to their summer studio that they had in Japan. They had no money. They had to close their offices. They were starting from scratch. They had no work. They found the farm basically in receivership. They were able to pay $1 and start paying the back taxes and become owners of it. It was an abandoned house that was a farmhouse, and the house was perhaps being rented to farmers who were renting it and using the fields. And this is how it appeared when the Raymonds first arrived. Next slide, please. It was literally empty. We're not sure exactly for how long. Next slide, please. And this was the back of the house. So it was a Quaker farm, but it had certainly seen better days. But it itself has a remarkable story, which I'll be showing you more in detail, discussing tomorrow in detail. Next slide, please. And this is that famous barn, which is an extraordinary barn. We get people coming to the Raymond farm. We don't care about the Raymonds. We want to see your barn. It is really kind of a fine example of 19th century Quaker barn. Actually, it's the components of the original 18th century barn within it, and I'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow's tour. Next slide, please. So this is how the Raymonds found the house when they first here. This is so in the barn with the dairy and the farm yard here, and the residence with these outbuildings attached. Next slide, please. And this is how the Raymonds added to it. They were really setting out to make a sustainable farm. This is again at the end of the Depression. They have no money. They think if we farm, nobody's going to starve, and this is coming at the end of the Depression after the Dust Bowl. So there's a lot of emphasis on modern conservation farming, which fits their ideas of our relationship to nature and how we sustain things. So you could see they had a very ambitious plans, but almost all of it was executed at the time. Many of these buildings have fell away over the years, but you'll see what remains tomorrow. Next slide, please. So they carefully measured the existing farmhouse, and one of the extraordinary things is they treated the house almost like an antique, which might not sound so radical, except remember, these are avant-garde modern architects, where usually this would be considered a teardown by most contemporary standards. One of the reasons why it wasn't a teardown was, first of all, Antonin, like George, fell in love with the Quaker aesthetics. It just seemed to be perfectly right. And also, like George finding this property, it was perfectly sited on the top of a knoll on a hill with this large south vista through the house is long and linear, working with the sun. There was so many good things about the bones of the house, but particularly the beautiful stonework. Antonin fell in love with the stonework of the barn as well. He reminded him of his grandparents' farmhouse back in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire outside of Kladno. But it also reminded him of all these amazing houses that Junzo Yoshimura, the young architect who will have also an intertwined career, will become one of George's best friends over his lifetime. What Junzo would take the Raymonds and George to all these places Americans usually want to go. He knew the places, he knew how to introduce themselves and get them into it and appreciate not the high style temple architecture that we usually associate with Japanese architecture, not the Buddhist or Shinto temples, but the farm, the practical farm, straightforward work, and this kind of the earth type quality. So the Raymonds carefully measure this house. This is Claude, their son, helping them measure. And the Raymonds do what we would call a gut rehab. Next slide, please. This is how they rehab it. And you'll see that they opened up the main space and created new bedrooms, actually using again the bones and structural lines of the house, but making totally new within it. Next slide, please. And then they started adding these Japanese modernist interventions and layering upon the building. Bill does a wonderful presentation talking about looking at the layering of this building, because it has so many periods in which the Raymonds are just but one, and even the contemporary period is one of the latest layers upon it. Next slide, please. But these are showing pictures of the original renovations as they were opening up, because they were creating new spaces where there were none, and mostly the major thing is they opened up a whole wall facing south so they could get light deep into the heart of the house. Next slide, please. This is this remarkable detail, which is probably first on our major list, among a major renovation, is these amazing outboard sliding doors and these column post system, these hand-weave posts, which carry the existing structural line of the house as they open up this 3-story atrium. Next slide, please. And this is what that atrium was when originally done. Unfortunately, the doors were replaced back in the 1970s during the first energy crisis, so this is why it's one of our major things to repair, and we'll see that tomorrow. But a remarkable house, this kind of modernist insertion within this Quaker farmhouse. Next slide, please. And these are all photographs from its first publication, 1941. The Raymonds, even though it was a modest job, it was really, again, a Depression-era job. The Raymonds are very proud of what they achieved, and this is published in Architectural Forum in 1941, right after it was completed. These are photographs, next slide please, of how it was in that publication. And many of you are probably familiar with Shifuso, and you may be aware of the Shifuso and Modernist exhibit, which Bill Whitaker was part of the curation, and also Elizabeth Seller was the photographer. And they based a lot of their work on the archival things that Bill had pulled out as they recreated a lot of these photographs, or approximated these photographs, of all the elements that were placed inside the house for that. So next slide, please.
The cats.
There's the cat.
There's 2 cats in that shot.
There's 2 cats.
The windowsill.
Oh my God.
No, I'm going back.
So these are all pictures. I'll tell a little story about the stools and everything, but all the interiors really, again, are reflections of Noemi's quality and design. Next slide, please. Forward. So these are all these, and you'll be there. Unfortunately, the Soji screens aren't in their tracks, and this is one of the reasons why we need to restore along that, but this is the original photographs. And you could see how, even though they're really taking pictures of the same space, how all these different vistas and the ability to move furnishing and pieces around by going to create different rooms within rooms, and how sometimes they're being used as studio spaces and sometimes as living spaces. Next slide, please. Again, just kind of these details. One of the things that they did was salvage a lot of the existing pieces there rather than just demolish them. They took the stairs carefully apart. They used them, and basically they used the existing house as if it was an antique and layered modernism over it, and inserting them carefully in different places. So you get this juxtaposition. This comes really from their philosophy that all good design is always good design. So the craft of a Quaker craftsman is just as good as a 20th century craftsman, which inspired their own work. Next slide, please. So you'll see, I guess this is really I know not all of you are going to be able to make it tomorrow, but you get an overview. So if you can't make it tomorrow, we always offer once a month during the summer months and into the fall, we always offer tours. And I always invite you to come back to one of those open house tours that we have. Next slide, please. So these are all these original 1941 photographs, which Bill helped recreate. A lot of these objects are in the same places that Bill replaced back some 4 or 5 years ago now. Next slide, please. And the Ravens modernized the farm itself. They put in new silos where there were never new silos. You see only the concrete foundations exist now. We were very interested in being a very contemporary, sustainable farm. I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. And one of those things that they did, which I get to mention tomorrow, but you actually could see, is contour farming. If you're familiar with the history of the Dust Bowl and why this kind of overplowing and drought combined to let the soils run away, part of the thing is that there was no natural way to irrigate slowly. There was no sheet action of water moving down the hill. And the Raymonds, I believe, were part of a program that was specially dedicated to the idea, and they actually had somebody come over and photograph the fact that they were implementing these principles of contour farming, following the lay of the land so the water would slowly, and again, this is what you do now when you do permaculture. But this is 1941, when they were all doing this. They also raised cows there, and those were examples of their prize-winning Jersey cows. They won the county fair. These are people who are not trained as in husbandry or as even farmers. You can imagine how proud they are to win the county fair. So the New Hope experiment was their version of the Taliesin Fellowship. In the first year, they had 24 young students. Mostly it was just a summer program. They would come and they would help work the farm, and they would work on their projects. This is a picture of that program that they'll create. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And this is their office staff from New York coming down. So the Raymond Farm became both the kind of teaching atelier, and it was also a salon where they had a lot of very famous friends come visit them from New York and up from Washington and Philadelphia. Next slide, please. And these are just life on the farm during this New Hope experiment period. Next slide, please. Another picture from a New Hope experiment. See Noemi there in the back. And this is the back of the head of Junso Yoshimura, I believe. And a beautiful Woody in the picture. And here they're out on the terrace. Again, Junso Yoshimura and Noemi. Anthony's obviously probably taking, looks like Anthony is there in the very far corner. Next slide, please. They didn't get very much work. This is right before World War I. It was like this little period of time. This is why Junzo Yoshimura is actually coming and working for the Raymonds here in the United States for 2 years. This is an exhibit of their work in Japan that was featured at Rockefeller Center. This exhibit kind of brought their work to America. Next slide, please. And these are textiles that Noemi was designing while she was here in the United States during this period of time, which will be featured at the Museum of Modern Art and actually make an introduction to Florence Knoll, which they would become friends. And some of these fabrics were one of the few things that Noemi ever had go into mass production. Incredibly beautiful work. And a big part of the mission of the Raymond Farm Center is telling Noemi's story, because she's really eclipsed. A lot of this work that you see here was all being credited to Antonin. We were saying Antonin was designing the furniture. When this was first exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art, Antonin was credited. Very similar to how Charles and Ray Eames now are household names in mid-century modern. But in the beginning, it was all Charles. Charles Eames was always considered the designer. Recently, back about 10 years ago, there was a new exhibit of that famous Knoll show that had the Eameses, the Saarinen, and the Raymonds were featured with all the names corrected. So finally giving credit to the women designers that were in collaboration. And next year's symposium at the Raymond Farm Center will be on the theme of collaborations to kind of clarify in history, to talk about the contributions of this dual team where they're almost acting like one mind, one heart in creating work. So they only did a handful of houses during this period of time. This is one in Frenchtown. Next slide, please. This one in Lambertville. These are the projects that those young architects would be working on. Next slide, please. There's a beautiful picture of Junzo sitting on the well with Noemi looking back towards the covered bridge. That's at the Van Zandt Bridge at the corner of the property. Noemi with her dog. She's always had dogs. Junzo Yoshimura was their right-hand person in design of projects. They had a special project. Junzo Yoshimura was the one who's going to be the project architect. This is, I think, the most extraordinary projects of this period. This is the Carrera House in Montauk, Long Island. Really a fine example of what we call American regionalism of this period of time, which really won't gather steam until the 1950s and into the 1960s, a Bay Region style. But this is an early example. Next slide, please. And Junzo Yoshimura worked on this wonderful memorial library, which would have been at the Library of Congress. That was in a memorial for the ambassador for Japan, who had died shortly before World War I, and was given an escort a naval escort back to Japan to return, to kind of bring back his body in honor. And I think it was actually a step to kind of defuse possible war moving to the United States. It was unexecuted, but Junzo Yoshimura did these drawings and did this beautiful, beautiful project that remained unexecuted because within months of this, Japan will invent that they Pearl Harbor. Next slide, please. So it's the image of Pearl Harbor, and of course, Mira already touched on the story, this tragic story of the what we call internment camps, but basically concentration camps during the war. Last year's symposium for the Raymond Farm was just about this theme. We had families and scholars talking about the artists who were actually part of this internment period and the works they contributed after their internment, which I think is one of the great. It's both a great strategy, but one of the tragedies of American civil rights. But it's also one of the most inspiring of how George and his generation transcend some of the most painful and traumatic periods in American history to transcend that and actually contribute back to this nation and make it more beautiful, more poetic, more meaningful. Next slide, please. So again, Mira already featured some of these photographs. John mentioned the shed. Here it is, the milk house shed. There's the milk house table. Next slide, please. So the Raymonds will do a whole series of work during the war, which I'll talk about a little bit. They're very disappointed with any kind of projects they're getting here in the United States, and I'll explain why. Part of it is because the culture, how you build something in the United States is so much different. I think, as John pointed out, there was no competitive bidding for the lowest bid. I think that's one of the things that frustrated the Raymonds. They were anxious to get back, and Anthony would make a trip in 1947 to see Japan. This is how he found it. And in 1951, he'll return to do the Reader's Digest building. And this is their home studio that they recreated at that point, which I had done a presentation earlier this year about. Next slide, please. At the same time in this period, Junzo Yoshimura, the Raymonds are asked to kind of make, to work on this project, the House and Garden at the Museum of Modern Art. And with Antonin's recommendation to the museum and the team there, he recommends Junzo Yoshimura to be the proper person to do the House and Garden, which was a very big part of Bill's amazing project that he did for Shifuso some 6 years ago. Next slide, please. And they would return to Japan to build this building, which is the Reader's Digest building, which will be heralded by none other than Kenzo Tange. If you're an architect, you know Kenzo Tange, one of the great architects of Japan, and heralded as the new beginning for modern architecture in Japan. This is 1953. Remarkable building. I'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. Next slide, please. And also remarkable that Isamu Noguchi, this will be the first landscape or sculpture that he did. Antonin had run into him in New York. Noguchi started to try for 30 years to try to do a landscape sculpture. And I said, well, I'll ask the people in Reader's Digest and see if we could do that. So this is a collaborative effort, again, showing this collaborative nature between the Raymonds and the people they work with. So it's a remarkable, and I did recently a presentation of this collaboration just in September, but I think I'll be doing it up at the Noguchi Museum. So if you could get on the Raymond mailing list, you'll see I'll be doing that same presentation then. Next slide, please. These are some of Noguchi and the Raymonds working together. Beautiful picture of this kind of landscape sculpture working with architecture. Next slide, please. So the Raymonds return in basically 1950. And will retire in 1970. They will build an additional 250 executed projects, and maybe that or more in unexecuted projects. They're unbelievably prolific. They have a very small office, like 25 people. This is part of the reason why they're able to do this is the collaborative nature of the architect working with the builder. Maybe we should think about that more as we move forward, that we make these exquisite buildings. And in Kenzo Tange's famous 1960 lecture, he actually calls Antonin the father of modern architecture. I guess that would make Noemi the mother of modern architecture in Japan, something we'll be pointing out more and more in the future. Next slide, please. So this is Antonin and Noemi retiring at the farm in 1970. They would build a small studio to paint and do ceramics. I'll talk about all the artwork that they did during this period of time. And this is them sitting right on the site, thinking about how best the sun will move and everything. Next slide, please. So this again is the Raymond farm. Next slide, please. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here and to be here in the fall and to drive up River Road and pass by these amazing sycamore trees with their white trunks against the blue sky. I always feel like I'm coming someplace when I come out here, and the gathering with you, any excuse to come up here, I think tells you why this is a place that you would want to be. You want to live your life here. This is a place that you would want to work. How do places like this happen in the world? How do they endure? How do they keep going into successive generations? These are the kind of questions that I think anyone who is in the kind of business that I am, which is mostly on the archives side of things, or my colleagues in historic preservation who are on the conservation side of things, these are places we want to know more about because we want to be a part of making sure that they endure into the future. The fact that you're all here, I think, also says something about the power of these places, and that why we should collectively think about ways that we seek to have them endure into the future. And one of the very special parts about this place is it still has the value of making furniture here. It's not something that has disappeared. There's a lot of people who contribute to making all of that work. But collectively, it is something that I think we should all celebrate, and so I take it as part of what we're doing today, that we're doing just that. I'm kind of a bridge in the proceedings today. making way for my colleagues from the Historic Preservation Program, from the Architectural Conservation Laboratory at Penn, who are going to get into the nitty-gritty of things. I'm following Mira and John, who are the two Johns. There's Johns everywhere today. In helping convey some of the stories. So and I've been working and connected to this story for over 25 years now. But I just want to thank a few people as a way to kind of recognize these different facets that I'm connected. So there's the team here at the Nakashimas, and I've mentioned Mira and John Yarnall. There's another John. There's Oriana, there's Dave, and there's Lauren. All of you have made the kind of work that we do to help make this place, to contribute to help make this place flourish in the future possible. And they're doing incredible work in terms of organizing archives, starting to make that stuff accessible, and that only feeds into the future about knowing these places and how these things happen. There's the team at Penn, Frank Matero, of course, but there's another John, Hinchman, Moji, Wendy, Michael. It's always incredible to collaborate with you and the incredible professionalism that you guys bring. It's so enriching to the kind of work that I do because it expands my understanding of heritage. Toshi, you're amazing. I don't think that today. I'm just giving you some cover. And then having John DeFazio here, I think, is also very special because one of the things that I've been interested in is recognizing that the work that George does is part of something bigger, and that the relationship and the mentorship and the situation that he walked into looking for a job in Tokyo in 1934 was really one of those steps that he couldn't have been in a better place at a better time for him, because it really helped open up an awareness of craft. He was an Art Deco architect. He was someone who, he was trained at MIT, but his professor is someone who is involved in designing, the cutting edge Art Deco architecture of the time. So that means you know about kind of integrating furniture into the work that you do, but he's not there yet. He's also out looking for a job in, summer of 1930, a little tough. And so, that time he has in New York City, and he never really talks about it. Artists in New York City in the 1930s, you're just hanging out because you don't have a lot of other things to do. He does have little jobs here and there, and he does work for the state, and that's important. All that production is kind of related to what we would see as Art Deco. Jones Beach is such an example. But these are the pieces that come together in making his future. But I think it's always been, for me, important to recognize that there's this larger circle in this part of America that speaks to these artistic interconnections between Japan and the United States, between spirituality and the modern world, between the hand and the heart and the mind, and how those things are deployed in creating living spaces and working spaces and places where you can connect with one another. So a lot of what I could talk about has been touched on. I'm also really lucky. I'm writing a book about George, and so come to me in a year when the book is out and I can tell you the full story. And part of what's making that possible is the opening up of the archives. There's incredible rich detail. And that having worked on the Raymonds through a number of projects, recognizing those interconnections, there's a fuller story to tell. But today, I want to get really narrow in focus, and as part of the team that focused on the family house, to kind of just tell you a couple of stories that in the work that I did really were important to the various stakeholders to tell those stories, to uncover them. There are also things that I have been curious about. What were those experiences? And in finding images and objects that are within collections, being someone who's part of an architectural collection, using those objects in teaching, realizing that the objects that you have that are part of creative process, and then going out to buildings and sites, and then retelling the stories in that setting and realizing those connections is interesting. So I'm going to be very narrow So Toshi, can we have the next slide, please? All right. So Nakashima in his world. This is one slide, one photograph that I found in doing the research that it took me a minute, but it really blew my mind. This is taken in April of 1948. The photo's not dated, but given the work that we did, focusing on the chronology of the house, of its design development, all of this nitty-gritty stuff that was so essential to my colleagues in the conservation side of things. I mean, like finding out when George bought a wheelbarrow. Tells you things. You know, where he's buying nails, the oak, that all is stuff that contributes to these incredible drawings you see on the wall. This is the family house, and you see there's no chimney coming out. That helps establish this is the spring after the first winter that they lived in the house. It also tells you that they didn't actually have the fireplace in the house at that moment in time, and they were using kind of flexible space heaters. There's another photograph that's part of the series that helps us establish that a little bit more. Behind George, you see the shop and also that Ford with, I love the detail, holes in the floor. But in the foreground, there he is sitting on a pile of wood with a couple of the kind of examples of what you might do with that material if you sit with it, if you engage with it in a particular way. And so the milk house table that's been referred to, the grass-seated chair, you know, and other furniture that he's doing, and he's just sitting there quite proud. This is his factory in a pasture, in the way he commented on it. So this idea of choosing where you work, establishing a place where you're living and working, having those places be close at hand, and then also having your material at your fingertips. These dynamic will grow and change over time. You know, I mean, I'm pretty in awe that I'm standing with this behind me. I think I've never looked so good. And some of these other elements, to be speaking to you in a room like this, this is it in its first form. This is what he had been searching for and looking at and to achieve for decades. You know, this is 1948, where his family is living on the site. His workshop is on the site. The materials he's going to work with are all present. And the future is there. And this was not something that was easy to achieve. And I'll touch on a couple of the stories in a moment where you see how he's bringing the threads together. But there's a piece of wood here, which is bitterbrush. This is a collection of wood that, you know, it's a tree, it's a small bush that grows in the Idaho desert. It's indigenous to that area. And it's something that the people, the Japanese Americans, the Japanese who were in the internment camps, it was something they felt like they went out and they were gathering that wood. They could gather pieces of it and you could strip the bark off of it. And you could find a way to make a work of art out of the struggles and the intensity that you might have been experiencing in that moment in time. And so in the course of doing the research for this project, you know, I was going through all the letters, and there's lots of letters. And there's one that's particularly poignant. It's, you know, around 1947, 48, where George's father is writing to him saying, oh, I've just sent you a box of greasewood, is what they were calling it at the time. And it was all of this wood that they had kind of collected as a family, or George had collected, and maybe he kind of forgot about. And he's sending it to his son. And this is something that he starts to incorporate into his work, sometimes in a handle and door. You know, these are places where you're touching, right? You're putting your hand and you're connecting in a way. So there's something transcendent in that sort of experience. But he's put this in the foreground. This piece is still floating around. It's still part of this campus. It's energized in a very specific way in a photograph like this. So this is a set of photos that were taken, as I said, in April 1948 by John Corcoran for Scientific Illustrated magazine. Marilyn Monroe was on the cover. It's a little weird. But for me, this is a sequence of photos that I think are one of the most kind of insightful portraits of George's world, just at that moment when it was taking definitive form. So let's go to the next one. I think this is one that you all have seen before. And I will say that you can see that I've marked them. And so photos that are on the left are in the Michener Museum archives. And so Mary Nakashima and Mira, there's part of the archives are with the Michener. And also, if you're in an archives, and if you're somebody who works in an archive, you know that kind of things get pulled apart because they have objects of energy in them. They have spirit in them. You want to connect with them. You want to use them. So you pull them out and you're taking them to another place. That's a beautiful thing. It drives archivists nuts. But on the back of photos are marks that tell you and establish certain associations. The magazine article itself includes some of these photos. The most recent kind of book that the Woodworkers has done includes this as a major image. The next one. It's got a lot going on. Next one. Focusing in on brass-seated chairs. A second one. This is one that's here at Nakashima Foundation. So just that pulling apart. Next one. Drawing. Drawing in the shop. Drawing on wood. Architects, we just think we draw on paper. It's so fascinating to change the surface upon which you draw, and to know if you draw on hardwood, you can plane it rather than erase it. So cool. Next one. The tools of the trade. Now, I think some of this is also we're seeing how media and others are starting to kind of perceive George, or maybe even how he's wanting to present himself, which is part of what builds his success. One of the things we don't see in these photos, and John so eloquently elaborated to that, there are other people who are part of making this world go. But for the meantime, this is George's world. Next one. Bending a chair back. 1, 2, 3. That's action. And then next, in the house. The next one. With his family. So this is where I'm seeing this as being this kind of full picture of the family, and that you're in, and Mira's sitting here, Marion's sitting there, the milk house table, that object that, in previous research, just finding a photograph of that piece when it was first made, and it's sitting on the 3rd floor of the Raymond farm, and George himself has taken the photograph, and when you flip it over, it says 1943. So there's a sequence of furniture that George is able to make at the farm based on getting a start in Seattle. There's a small number of about 10, 12 projects in Seattle where he's making his first furniture. There's probably not a piece of furniture that he himself made before 1940 in Seattle, except maybe he was a Boy Scout, but I'll get to that. At the Raven Farm, there's about 12 or 14 pieces that are made. That's one of them. Next. This one I love because it's father and daughter. That's the window where the fireplace is. And how could you guys be standing there if there was a fireplace there? And that this is the door that you like to talk about, which was a sliding door to conveniently load in the wood so that you could keep yourselves warm in the winter. So this is a set of photos at the end of that first winter where they had lived in this house. One of the things I really appreciated about working with my colleagues in the Architectural Conservation Laboratory is they got all technical on me, but I loved it. The period of inhabitation overlapped the period of construction. So they moved in, half of the house was not done yet, they slept on the floor, the floors weren't necessarily done, the facade wasn't complete, they had no bedrooms. That all happens over the course of the next several years, and the house is not really finished until 1952. I mean, it has heat by the end of 48, so they're a little bit more comfortable. But changes need to be made, and those subtle little nuanced differences are all part of what makes the story real. It's all part of what makes the building so connected to the Nakashima's lives here. Okay. All right. So I got 2 little vignettes that I want to share with you. And maybe just catch up for a second. And, okay. Next one. Another image that absolutely blew me away when I found it. This is George and his parents posed presumably within his first year. It's in Spokane. There's a second one. This is the one that's at the Michener. There's another one here where this kind of beautiful, pose of George, his father, and their little puppy dog. You see the little puppy dog? There's a dozen photos of George with his little puppy dog, and he's got two beautiful spots on his back. But they're posed for, look at his mother. She is one of the most sophisticated women, in terms of the experiences she had being part of the royal court. But here she is part of the American scene. They are making a life here in America. They've come to America to look for opportunities. His father is very well educated, goes to a Western-oriented school, and he comes here and he's managing labor. He can speak both languages. And his wife comes over as one of the picture brides. They get married on the ship before she even gets off the ship. And to find these little beats of history and the very specific moments in time was part of what our interest was. Next slide. This is the family house in Seattle. So George was born in Spokane. They lived in Pasco. Father was following the railroads and was part of a company called the Oriental Trading Company, but winds up in Seattle, and he's kind of improving his station over time. And his language skills and, the family is becoming important representatives of the Japanese community. If you're the one that's the middleman between the railroads, so the Northern Pacific Railroad, and the laborers, you become a voice for your community. And Mira's Okajima grandfather, so Marion's father, was also in a position like this as a translator. So these are two men, two father figures, father-in-law and a father, who were important figures thinking about the station, the position of Japanese Americans in this country, and thinking about their future, and thinking about the racism that was going on at the time. But this is the family house. This is where George grew up. It's the home he came to when he was going to school, and it's where he wrote letters back to when he was traveling the world. So it's the family home until about 1935. Another terrific image, just standing under the American flag. So there's this idea of Americanization and embracing the experience of living in this country. And two of George's siblings are there, and so he's the guy with the hat, the eldest. And there's a younger sibling yet to be born with mother, father. Right, next slide. But for me, that, perhaps the most significant expression of this Americanizing impulse for George, and I'm just reading a bit of what I wrote for the project, was his avid participation in scouting. And I have to thank Dave Long, who's in the back there, for kind of bringing this to my attention. Maybe I would have stumbled up on it at some point, but this is where archivists and people who are spending their lives working with objects, are really invaluable characters in helping tell stories. They have a sensitivity to things. So scouting had come to America in 1910, and the first troops were organized in Seattle by that summer. Nakashima's time in the Scouts spanned from the fall of 1917 through the end of his senior year in high school, and then continued for another couple years after that, where he was an assistant scoutmaster for his first 2 years of college, by which time at the end he had achieved the rank of Eagle Scout. That's right at the moment where he's transitioning from being a forester, being involved in forestry, to becoming an architect. The Region Scout troops focused on outdoor activity, building self-confidence, and a sense of adventure, and stoking a strong moral sensibility for assisting others. But their real excitement was in trekking. Let's go to the next one. This is not an image that's part of the archives here. There are lots of beautiful photos that show scouts with snowshoes going through a snowfield, crossing the incredible Cascade Mountains on the Olympic Peninsula. George was all a part of that. So the real excitement was in trekking and snowshoeing across the Cascades during his winter break in 1918, to numerous monumental hikes during his annual summer visits to Camp Parsons, on the heavily forested Olympic Peninsula. These included an epic 100-mile hike that began on the Hood Canal, followed the Dozel Alps, no, don't know that one, past the Two Brothers, Mount Constance, and crossed the divide to the Pacific Ocean at the mouth of the Quinault River, taken in part over the challenging Skyline Trail, and that group did it in just 6 days. In this context, Nakashima built a sturdy and enduring sense of self in this environment, finding in the direct experience of the wilderness a lifelong love of nature and a feeling for the value of natural systems and humanity's place in it. Here he learned to enjoy the solitude, and I'm quoting him, and quiet of lonely places. These solitary trips, he later recalled, had a profound meaning to me. I had a sense of viewing creativity at its source. These trips dramatized for me the joy of living simply, close to nature, of fishing small lakes nestled like jewels in the crease of a mountain. On these climbs, I had an irresistible yearning to explore the next pass, to see what lay on the other side of the mountain, to gaze at new vistas. So through these experiences, he became a strong, physically fit, adventurous teenager who was not only adept at water swimming, but found himself drawn to sports of all kinds, even mastering the pole vault. There's also him in a football uniform, which I'm not quite sure about that. But, we're not good at, I'm not good at that either. I cut that one out, but he went to Franklin High School. So there's also these kind of weird kind of resonances and thinking about the association with coming to this part of the United States under the circumstances they did. That's obviously a reference to Ben Franklin. And so maybe there's these strange connections to Pennsylvania. This was another set of photos. This I first saw in a wonderful documentary film that George's nephew did. And it's this irresistible image of Prince William Sound up in Alaska, and knowing that George, after he left the Scouts, also found other ways to engage with the natural world. So I mean, this is all part of the kind of context of just slowing ourselves down and reminding ourselves of these origins of his experience in the world and how they kind of rooted in. And while he was pursuing architecture and doing other things, maybe in conventional terms, those are things that kept drawing him back into some other configuration. And ultimately, that's part of what we're celebrating here. So, next image. So here he is. This is the summer of 1924. To the best of our knowledge, I have never found an instance where he worked for an architect during his studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. This is his first semester, this is the summer where he's taken some courses at the University of Washington under Carl Gould, who becomes a great educator for George and kind of brings him into architecture. But look, he's up on the top of a hill. He's working at a fish cannery in Cordova, Alaska. Next slide. Here's his buddy. And this was partly digging into the archives and starting to put together the pieces. So this is a photograph that George himself took. Next slide. This is the kind of stuff that someone who's nuts like me likes to do, is you find images and you make sure this is taken in Cordova, so you can see the little notch there, the little island match up with that image. Thank God for drones and that people post this online. Next image. Here's the guy. Here's the guy writing to George in 1952, remembering the time 27 years ago where they spent the summer together in Alaska. And this is the sketch George made of him. George had just won the Craftsmanship Award for the AIA, and there's from the American Institute of Architects. So there's this wonderful, kind of reconnecting with George as an individual. Another letter that I'm not showing you here is from an architect friend, someone he went to MIT with, and who had jointly traveled with him down to New York, and they lived in some rat-infested apartment in the West Village. That was a quote. That man was James Carr, also recounted, never forgetting how George spoke so vividly about his desire to be able to plant trees to grow the trees, to harvest the trees, and to make masterpieces of them. That's 1930. So there's this kind of conversation that's emanating and that's becoming visible again about what drives him to create places like that and to make the connections like this. Next image. He hands off the camera to his buddy. The camera, he takes a picture. What is the difference? His mustache. It's a thin one. He's 19 years old, right? Is that right, 1924?
Yep.
You're 19 years old. Okay. All right, so next one. Okay. So the second education. So second education, maybe a way of thinking about that is, you know, George has this experience in the Scouts, connection to the outdoors, and so seeks a career in forestry. He pursues that for 3.5 semesters at University of Washington. He learns to set up camp. He learns how to, you know, to lay out the process of roads, to select trees, to organize trees, to identify trees. But he turns away from that with the idea of finding and pursuing a career that's more creative and maybe more connected with building. That brings him into architecture. The second, and so he spends the better part of 10 years becoming an architect, and that flows through his time with the Raymonds. And this conversation, this beat that is underlying his experience, all the while is a presence there that really gets, in a sense, resolved at the ashram in India. The second education idea is that it's those transformative moments at the ashram and in the camps that really are signaling shift. So next slide. None better kind of embodied than a photograph like this, where you see him dressed in the traditional clothing of that area of southern India. The photograph's taken right before this. He's all in a suit. He's got spectacles on. He looks polished. There's just this feeling of transformation that's occurred in an image like this. Next image. So he comes back to America. He's met Marion in Japan. They get married. That was all referred to. And they've settled down in Seattle. He's working as an architect. He's starting to make furniture. He's trying to come up with a vision for the future, which involves the idea, at least at this point, that he's going to be an architect. He's going to design work. He's going to have a team of people that can build the work. He'll do some furniture. He's going to build houses. All's going to be great. And Mira is born. And it's where, as an objects person, you start to look, and I think anyone who works with conservation, or maybe anyone who works in art, are objects people. But March
24 says, that's when we were interned.
That's not quite. I think that's when you're leaving your apartment in Seattle to go down to Portland.
29,
Oh,
1942.
29?
Oh, this is a 1. Is that a 1?
This is a 9.
That's a 9. Okay.
This is a 9-month debate we're gonna have.
I mean, the photograph is brilliantly stored up in the family house. We can all go look at it, right, Lauren? Yeah, Lauren said no. Okay. So let me just read a little bit here. So for Nakashima, there would be no going back to the practice of architecture as he knew it. But he was surely aware of the darkening clouds of war on the horizon. That's why he left India in the first place. War had broken out in Europe in September '39. He could not have anticipated that within the next 18 months, while basking in the joy of marriage to Marion in Los Angeles on February 14th, 1941, and with the birth of their child, Mira, born in Seattle on February 11th, 1942, that his entire extended family would be required by the United States government to turn themselves in as enemy aliens and be subjected to what was euphemistically termed relocation. So one of the important values of the foundation was to be able to tell this story. And one of the things I did was take a trip out to the Japanese American Museum in Los Angeles. They have an incredible display, beautifully written and conceived, that really was essential in helping me tell this story. So when the forces of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered World War II, that tension that existed between American ideals and American practices reached a breaking point. Now Japanese Americans were not just different, they looked like the enemy. Of the 127,000 Japanese Americans living on the US mainland, most were living in Washington, Oregon, and California. The government moved fast, and under the guise of military necessity, it began preparations to forcibly remove all West Coast Japanese Americans to concentration camps away from the coast. As Henry Lamore put it in the San Francisco Examiner, I am for the immediate removal of every Japanese on the West Coast to a point deep in the interior. I don't mean the nice part of the interior either. Herd them up, pack them up, and give them the inside room in the Badlands. Personally, I hate the Japanese, and that goes for all of them. With anti-Japanese hysteria sweeping the nation, the wheels of mass incarceration were set in motion. By early 1942, Japanese Americans living on the West Coast knew that they would be forced to leave their homes, businesses, and friends. These actions by the government were intended to deliberately destroy Japanese American communities on the West Coast. All told, more than 120,000 people would be incarcerated. 2/3 of them were American citizens who would be referred to euphemistically as non-aliens. The rest, born in Japan, were referred to as aliens ineligible for citizenship. The words chosen by the government officials to describe the camps that Japanese Americans would be moved to were relocation centers. This was a euphemism used to downplay the significance of its actions. These places were, by definition, concentration camps. The term was used by government officials at the time, and it is crucial to note that concentration camp is defined broadly as a place where people are imprisoned not because they are guilty of any crime, but because they are simply who they are. Despite some differences, all concentration camps have one thing in common. People in power remove a minority group from the general population, and the rest of society lets it happen. For the Nakashima and Okajima families, the process of incarceration played out as follows. George married and their newly born daughter Mira, who was less than 3 months old, packed up their rental house in Seattle and placed all non-essential belongings in storage. Let's go back one. Thanks. I think that's leaving the house in Seattle. Marion's father, Kenya, and her eldest sister Thelma, who were living in Los Angeles, did the same. The two family groups in turn gathered at the home of George's parents at 4111 Southeast Madison Street, Portland, Oregon, to await evacuation orders. Next. Evacuees, as the government euphemistically called them, were only allowed to take a limited amount of clothing and equipment into the camps. For George, that meant he left his woodworking tools behind. In Portland, evacuation orders were posted on Tuesday, April 28th, giving notice to all of Japanese ancestry in Portland area that they were to be evacuated by 12 noon on May 5th. That's from the paper. That's the family house. And we catch up. Before their surrender, Nakashima's parents paused to photograph their house and for a portrait. Go to the next one. These are dated May 1942. Another photograph captured George packing the family's belongings into a friend's car on the morning of May 5th. Next. Again, that's Marion's handwriting. This is Marion's voice. This is Marion's experience, and this was very, very traumatic for Marion. These are included in a family album. The handwritten note, annotations at the bottom are by Marion. For the next 4 months, the family lived under the roof of a massive structure, the Pacific International Livestock Exhibition Pavilion in North Portland. Next. A structure that was designed as a livestock exhibition center and rodeo venue. While the Army removed the original pens and stalls of the animals, the stench of the site's former inhabitants remained. Each family was allocated a living area built of plywood panels 8 feet high, with the roof of the pavilion some 30 feet above. Sounds and smells carried. It was a difficult task to get Mira to sleep. The site was surrounded by barbed wire and controlled by machine gun equipped sentry towers at the corners. Next. Marion's sister Thelma provided a first-hand account of the day of their arrival in her journal entry for May 5th, 1942. Pacific International Stockyards exhibit. all personal pain lost in suffering that little Mira must be here. Exposed to unsanitary condition, the whole outrageous situation maddens me, yet I am helpless. This is an object that is preserved in the family's papers. It is precious because it's got an X on it. I'm presuming that was their quarters. Next one. Okay. The family was transferred to the Minidoka Relocation Center in Hunt, Idaho in September, arriving on the 9th, a God-forsaken land of barrenness, as Marion recalled it. In total, the Nakashimas would spend 230 days living in the high, windswept desert of Idaho. Their address, 34-3F, meaning Building 34 in Residential Block 34. Building 3 in the Residential Block 34, which is marked right there by the star. The dust and high altitude makes it difficult to breathe. But what really disturbed Marion was the fact that there are no provisions for bathing babies or caring for them, washing clothes, particularly in cold water, and bringing them out to dry, and the dust seems rather a thankless job. There are about 300 people in each so-called block, she noted, with one mess hall, one laundry, and one shower room. The dust-laden air irritates our noses, our throats, and our lungs. What a place to have to bring babies and old people. It is a mess. Barrack buildings, and you're seeing a photograph, presumably of Building 3, where the Nakashimas were quartered, were identically built and measured 120 by 16 feet. Interiors were divided into 4 or 6 tiny apartments with a 20 by 16 foot room housing a family of 2 or more, or 3 or more single people. Nakashima was employed at the camp with the duty of design and planning of rooms and housing for social betterment of the project. Yes. Okay, there's a couple more slides. Are these the scraps of wood George is using to start to modify the interiors to make this a special place? And there's an image that Mira showed, but that's where I don't know what November 16th, 1942 means as a date. So, to be discovered in the future. Okay. So for his work, designing and planning the rooms of housing for social betterment of the project, he was paid $19 a month. While this may seem a pittance, and it was, the work afforded him the opportunity of the second education and learning the woodworking practice and skill directly from a well-trained Japanese carpenter, Gintaro Kenneth Hikogawa, just a couple years older than George. Next slide. While Hikogawa was only a few years older than Nakashima, the carpenter had a defining impact on the architect in his development as a woodworker. Hikogawa had been apprenticed to a traditional Japanese carpenter, or daiku, at age 15. By 24, driven by economic need, he stowed away on a steamer bound for Seattle. In the United States, the objective of making a new start meant that he worked a range of jobs, from waiter, dishwasher, to fish grinder, before he was able to return to carpentry work in 1935, when he assumed doing house repairs and building furniture. Hikogawa was incarcerated along with his family, arriving first at the Puyallup, thank you, Assembly Center in May 14, 1942, and Minidoka by August 21st. Okay. For Hikogawa, Nakashima learned not only the use of Japanese hand tools and the traditional methods of joinery, but also absorbed Hikogawa's reverence for trees. As author David Lane noted in the Densho Encyclopedia, for any traditionally trained Japanese carpenter, trees had deep spiritual, even sacred value, demanding lifelong devotion. There was no distinction between work of the spirit and that of the hand. The spiritual life of the tree remained vital from harvesting to finishing. Hikogawa's training grew out of this traditional reverence for wood and spoke deeply to Nakashima, who deplored the 20th century's obsession with mass production and synthetic materials. Part of the context of the creation of the house are examples in American architecture like the house of Charles and Ray Eames, made from off-the-shelf, industrially produced materials. There's a wonderful sense of environment with the Eameses, but not far from here, you also have this other entity that is Levittown. And the kind of suburbanization and character of that is also part of the context of the creating of the house. But to go back to Hikogawa, reinforced by his previous visits to Japan, during which he gained an appreciation for Japanese spiritual traditions, Nakashima was well primed to benefit from Gintaro's spiritual connection to wood. Nakashima credits Hikogawa with teaching him the proper care of tools, the way of the tool, and the demand for rigorous training in those regards. It was not uncommon to spend 4 hours sharpening to every 6 hours of sawing. So as an apprentice, Hikogawa would have spent a year or more just learning how to sharpen his tools before he would even be allowed to touch the material of wood. These are lessons he imparted on Nakashima. Nakashima was only in the camp from September until May 1st of 19, so the time was short and compressed, but basically they were able to spend every day together with tools provided thanks to the US government, I guess. Hikogawa's greatest influence on Nakashima may have been his mastery of Japanese joinery, an art form rooted in the nature of his native Japan. Japan's earthquake-prone geology required the use of a staggering variety of ingenious joinery patterns designed to provide flexibility and shock absorption during an earthquake. George brought a group of 8 or 10, not 8, I think it's 6, reference books that are the life of a traditional carpenter. It's the building construction guide for Japanese interwar houses. These are a series of references that he noted and listed in a volume accounting for his move and leaving from Seattle. They're books that are still part of the archive, so you can look at the details in those volumes and you can see their echoes into the furniture making, but more so into the buildings that are done here. Okay. So Nakashima worked alongside Hikogawa on almost a daily basis. They were practical projects that allowed for the fabrication of flower boxes, tool boxes, and practical items like sawhorses to be made for the general benefit of the community. One of the activities that Hikogawa and Nakashima engaged in was the collection of wood from the native scrub brush trees, locally known as greasewood or bitterbrush, for use in making improvements to barrack interiors. Photographer Francis Leroy Stewart, working for the War Relocation Authority, documented examples of this work on December 1942, capturing views of both Nakashima and Hikogawa at work. And that's Hikogawa, and go back for one.
I'll go back.
And that's captured on the same day. George is the designer, and he makes this distinction of working with Hikogawa, but it's in that context, Hikogawa seemingly has a bit of the lead. Okay? Okay. So Lauren's winking at me saying it's time to wrap up. And so I want to end with this photograph. It's on the same page as the photos of the barracks building in Minidoka. I'm not sure if this was taken there or not, because Marion did not date this. But there's 2 photographs. There's a second one. There's snow on the ground. In the other one, I don't see any buildings. I don't see any features in the distance. Is this Mira's first birthday? Is it her first birthday celebrated at the camp? Not sure. But I'm leaving this story there. You're going to have to buy the book. I mean, you're going to have to invite me back, and I can give you the long form, because 25, 30 minutes is not enough time to get all this amazing stuff. But I want to leave you with some numbers. George and Marion, and these are the things that coincidences that come up in one's mind. George and Marion are married in Los Angeles on February 14th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is on December 7th, 1941. Mira is born on February 11, 1942. They turn on the power in the shop building on this site on February 14th, 1946.
Wow.
Their 5th anniversary. They move into the house, and again, this is absolutely true. There's letters. This is when the family moved in on December 7th, 1947. I'll leave it there.
Everybody, I'm sorry, Anna, I had the pleasure of welcoming you here and checking you in. Thank you all for coming, first of all. It's nice to have your support. I have the pleasure of working for the Nakashima Foundation. And in the last 6 years, I've been tasked with a number of special initiatives, bringing grants in, managing grants, doing a full collection inventory. I have a museum background, so it's been fun to do that, bring that kind of interest to the foundation. We are a National Historic Landmark, you may know. In 2014, we received that designation. Also the same year that we were listed on the World Monument Fund. And with those designations comes the responsibility of taking care of these incredible buildings. There are 15 or so buildings on the property. 3 of them are owned by the foundation. And we started a program of bringing grants in to take care of them. Starting with the National Endowment for the Humanities grant 5 years ago for archives preservation. We also received some money from the state of Pennsylvania for archives preservation, also from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. But what this project you will hear about is related to the Nakashima Family House. When Kevin Nakashima passed away in 2020, he was the last family occupant of the house. He spent his entire life in the house, and if you could imagine, it was full of family memorabilia, Kevin's stuff, and it was a challenge to figure out how to best preserve it, organize it, clean it up, and preserve it for future generations. So we did receive grants from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Sorry, I'm out of breath. To start that process. And the planning behind that includes hiring all these wonderful people from the University of Pennsylvania. They are the consultants in historic preservation and came up with a HSR. That's an historic structures report that we are using as a roadmap for preservation. You will see the family house on our tour this afternoon. Please ask questions. We do plan to continue the preservation of this site. There's a lot of work to be done. And we have a very fine group of staff. I'd like to thank them for the support. I'd like to thank you all for coming and showing your support for the work that we do here. Thank you. Turning it over to John Hinchman.
So I just want to say something right off the bat. I'm going to give a presentation after my great students here, but before I get started, my name is John Hinchman. I work at the University of Pennsylvania, and I have 2 roles there. I'm the project manager for the Center for Architectural Conservation, the director of whom is Frank Matero. Frank Matero couldn't be here this afternoon. I'm also a faculty member there, and I teach in the Historic Preservation program. I graduated from the program in 2001. Frank Matero was my mentor, taught me conservation. He's also the head of the program at Penn, the preservation program in which I teach. I was hired by Frank Matero. I suspect that Michael Henry can say the same. So Frank Matero is a big player in our lives, and he was a very, very important part in this project. This project, I don't think, probably would have happened without Frank Matero. Unfortunately, Frank's not able to be with us today, but he has asked me to read something that he wrote. So if you give me the opportunity, let me... When the Center for Architectural Conservation agreed to record the Nakashima Family House to help guide future planning for the complex, the team had no idea what a complex story would unfold, told through the changes visible and invisible in the fabric of the house. What slowly was revealed was a story of a family told through the house itself. This is precisely why we document the buildings we live, play, and work in. They capture the day-to-day, year-to-year events that tell a fuller story than any one line of evidence can reveal. Coupled with oral histories, family records, and the contents accumulated over multiple generations, the house becomes the repository of lives lived. How that information will be used to tell the story of the Nakashima Family House in Bucks County is the next big hurdle, but that information captured using the most up-to-date advanced digital methods remains the glory of this current project. This study documents and records the historical and architectural development of the George Nakashima Family House in New Hope, Pennsylvania, and its current environmental context and performance. The format for the study is a departure from the traditional historic structure report, given the intended application of the study to guide future conservation, interpretation, and management of the house. Each section of the document contains the relevant information on the social history of the construction and occupation of the house by the Nakashima family, the morphological evidence of the house through detailed measured drawings and photographs, and a performance evaluation of the building and its environment. Different formats were chosen by each specialist to best convey the information. Each investigation revealed a complex narrative interweaving personal, cultural, and practical decisions that allowed George Nakashima to create a truly hybridized modern Japanese house on American soil. On behalf of the team, I would personally like to thank the Nakashima family and the staff of the George Nakashima Foundation for Peace for the opportunity to engage with this remarkable structure, and to the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission and the National Trust for Historic Preservation for their financial support. And now I'd like to turn this over to our first speaker today, which is going to be Paridhi Goel. Oh, no, sorry. Oh, I'm looking at it in order now. I should have switched. So I'm gonna turn it over to Moji. He's going to talk about the documentation process, the process we went through to collect the information. Paridhi's going to follow up. She's going to talk about the process we went through to create the amazing drawings that you guys can see on the walls. And then I'm going to follow up. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the discoveries and challenges that we faced trying to figure out the parts of the building and how the building looks down. So I'm going to turn it over to Moji.
What's wrong with you? It's all yours. Hello everyone. My name is Mojtaba Saffarian. I go also by Moji. My work on this project began in fall 2023 when Penn began preparing an HSR for the house. I saw it as a great opportunity to use the house as a case study for my thesis, which explored how the building formation modeling can be applied in historic preservation. After graduating in summer 2024, I continued working for Penn, focusing specifically on the Nakashima House as the first project after graduation, and my role has been to produce a set of drawings documenting its current condition and illustrate how the house has evolved over time. So my contribution to the project can be grouped in three main areas: data collection, 3D modeling, and layout. Next slide. The data collection process relied primarily on the 3D laser scanning using a Tringle X7 scanner. We completed the scanning in two phases. The first in October 23 and the second in June 24 to capture areas that were missed or needed higher accuracy. In total, we scanned from 66 locations. That's the correct number, covering both interior and exterior spaces, as well as the gable roof, ceiling cavity, and the crawl space. Next slide. Hundreds of photographs, also both contextual shots and detailed close-up, were taken as part of the data collection. These, along with the field measurements and hand drawing notes, serve additional references throughout the documentation process, besides using the scanner. Next slide, please. The next step toward 3D modeling was processing the field scans. This included finalizing the scan registration of the scanner itself, and making sure all 66 scans align correctly. After the processed the raw point clouds, one important part of this step was cleaning the vegetations around the house so we could clearly see the building. Here is a screenshot of the point cloud after removing the surrounding trees. Additional clearing was done to reduce the size of the point cloud and isolate only the house. Once that was complete, the file was ready to be forwarded into our chosen 3D software, SketchUp, a low-cost, user-friendly program that is highly capable when it comes to modeling, rendering, and exporting drawings in various formats for post-production. In addition to its highly capable plugin just called Scan Essential, which was to enable us to work on the point cloud on the software itself. Next slide, please. Yeah. From the start of the project, we knew we needed two different sets of drawings. One set was the architectural drawings, plans, elevations, sections, and details, and the other set needed to show the evolution of the building. Based on the historic documentation we already knew there were two major modifications made after the house was originally built. As the modeling progressed, we had made discussions about how the house was constructed and what adjustments would have been required to accommodate those later changes. Because of this, we decided to create the model. The model with as much detail as possible, so it could serve both purposes, producing the architectural drawings and generating any 2D and 3D columns needed to explain the construction and its evolution in the process. In the process, we essentially ended up simulating the house's construction and transformation over time, beginning from the stone wall on the north and its adjacent crawl space. Slide. Yeah. To the foundation system. Next slide. To the posts. Next slide. Diagonal struts. Next slide. Transverse beams or beards. Next slide. Yeah. Horizontal purlins placed on top of the girds. Next slide. And the next. And finally, the shed roof built in two sections with different material, one finished with concrete ties on the other, concrete ties and the other with asbestos corrugated panels. Next, please. Here the model shows the first phase of construction completed in 1946, included the north entry, living room, kitchen, and bathroom enclosed. Next, please. The model was then developed to represent the house after the completion of the second phase in 1948, which enclosed the parents' and Mira's bedrooms. Then in 1956, with the birth of Nakashima's son, Kevin, another bedroom was added on the southeast end of the house. And finally, we modeled the last major modification from 1982, which included adding the new gable roof, extending the house on the south and west sides, and reconfiguring the north entry. As seen developed details in the model allowed us to extract everything from overall massing to the small construction details from any angle and layer, telling the narrative of the structure hiding behind the surface. Creating such a detailed 3D model also supported the integration of the building's narrative with the drawings, an approach that the historic preservation program actively promotes. Next, please. Now the model is completed, we moved into the layout phase. This involved exporting 2D drawings from SketchUp into AutoCAD and then post-processing them to meet HAB's guidelines, Historic American Building Survey, which works under National Historic Parts that instructs how to document the building, historic building. That included adjusting the sheet layouts, line weights, annotation, text style, fonts, patch, and all that graphics. And as we as well as having the evolution of the house shown at a glance in a single sheet. Next slide. Thanks to having tons of colors extracted from the model, which itself overload us in case of choosing the appropriate drawings for what we needed to explain. A set of drawings, what we call the preservation drawings, was created to show the sequence of the construction as described. These sheets incorporate various types of information, including 3D and 2D drawings, historic and contemporary photograph, sketch, and text. I'm going to pass it to Paridhi for more discussion on the layout and research. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paridhi. Thank you all for being here. Mojtaba has already walked us through the evolution of house over the years through the 3D model he worked a long time on. So I joined George Nakashima Family House project later in the process, which turned out to be a unique opportunity. It allowed me to step back and take a more comprehensive approach to the layout process. This project isn't just about drawings or measurements. It's about telling a story of how Nakashima met the reality of lived experience. Today I share technical drawing set interpretation, reorganizing different phases, and how we build a visual narrative that captures both the architecture and life within it. By the end, I hope you'll see not only the meticulous process behind preservation documentation, but also careful analysis can bring structures, history, and spirit vividly to life. My first step was to dive into technical drawings prepared by Moji and John, trace the evolution of the house. There was no verbal briefing. Not because they didn't want to talk to me or there was any barrier, but it was purposeful. So I wouldn't inherit assumptions about what Hab's drawings were supposed to say. That actually worked in our favor. Plus, it gave me the classic architect moment, looking and thinking at the drawings. Okay, what are these drawings trying to tell me? We restructured the sheets to reveal the house's full arc from its initial conception to the way it continued to live and adapt. The sequence leads the reader through the chronology and underlying concept, making visible how every design decision informed both its origin and its evolution. To make sense of the material in a more meaningful way, we decided to bring two construction phases together into a single sheet. The first phase captures Nakashima's original spatial intent, how he envisioned the house before anyone lived in it. The second phase represents the post-habitation adjustments, quite phase the design responded to the family's daily life. By layering these two phases, we could actually see the conversation between design and its use, how lived experiences reshapes form, shift boundaries, or introduce new needs. Once we combine them, the drawing showed that preservation isn't simply about recording what was. It's about understanding how a place continues to adapt. Structuring the narrative. The process revealed how documentation itself can serve as an interpretative tool, not just record making. A structured sheet order and 3D 2D integration established coherence and readability across complex data. This workflow encouraged cross-disciplinary collaboration between design, research, and within our team. What emerged was more than a collection of drawings. It became an interpretative framework, a way to see preservation. The sequence, sheet order, visual hierarchy allowed us to communicate how Nakashima Family House transformed. We interrelated research and 3D models prepared by Moji using labels as seen in the text. So, the drawing is a little bit blurry, but as you can see, we added labels, and these labels were integrated into text. And once you read the text, as you can see the drawings here in the room, we could easily connect it to the photographs. Interpreting technical drawings. When I first started working with technical drawings that John and Moji prepared, it became a really important moment in the layout process. the precision of their work allowed me to understand not just what house looks like, but what it became and what it is. Even without me being on site, the drawings reveal the architectural logic, decisions, and quiet adjustments that shaped the Nakashima house over time. What surprised me was how the drawings naturally created room for interpretation. They didn't just show dimensions, they sparked an internal dialogue, which led to an insightful conversation, discussions, leading to working on finding facts. Through them, we began thinking about the construction and living experience of the space, how architecture responded to daily life. One example that stood out to me was noticing a new room in phase 2 drawings. It indicated Kevin Nakashima's birth. This detail showed how family life directly influenced evolution of the house. We verified certain terms we use, which John is going to talk about in length. I'm going to tell you, just share how we verified these Japanese terms. By conducting a meticulous verification of these Japanese architectural terms, we ensure that every label and description accurately reflects traditional usage and the design philosophy behind it. This step went far beyond translation. It was fundamental to preserving the cultural integrity of the documentation. In connecting language with architectural meaning, we honored the heritage, symbolism, and nuance embedded in these terms. This careful attention to detail not only strengthened the accuracy of our work, but also aided in making the documentation a culturally grounded resource for understanding these timeless structure. I now turn over to John, who will discuss this part more in detail. Thank you.
I think something that's really important for you guys to understand, I know a lot of you guys are architects, designers, civil designers, many of you do preservation work. And one of the things I want to stress that we learn in preservation is that when you're documenting a building, everything matters. Every part, every nail, every piece of wood, because every piece in one way or another tells something about the history and evolution of the building itself. And trying to figure out all the parts on this house. It's not a big house. You guys probably have seen it up there. I hope you have an opportunity to walk through it. It is not a big house, but it is a complex house. There's a lot of parts to it. So I put up here the word discovery. And if we think about what that discovery means, it's about removing the cover. So I'm going to do that for you a little bit. If I covered everything that we figured out in this building, it would take me hours. So we're going to keep this limited. So I'm going to start by removing the cover literally. We're going to start with this roof. If you've walked up there, you've noticed that it's got a gable roof on it. But from some of the photographs that you guys have seen, it actually originally had a shed roof that sloped away from the south to the north. So it was higher on the south, lower on the north. This roof, as you see it now, has the gable roof on it, and that shed roof is still in there. He never removed that shed roof. Now, I remember talking with Michael Henry about this right at the very beginning when we got started, and he said, look, there's this narrative about these roof parts. We really don't fully understand it. And try to be able to get the information about this roof. Obviously, a laser scanner is going to give you a lot of information, but a laser scanner can't see through things. It can only see what it can see. And the only option we have for being able to take information from the gap between the two roofs is through these openings. There was one on each end. It's a tiny little opening. It was about this big. So we put the laser scanner in, and we were able to get a scan on each end. But of course, this building's quite long. Laser scanner will give you a lot of points, but it won't make up data that you can't see. So here's the design originally. Here are the elements that make up that shed roof. You can see it sloping backwards towards the north wall, which is the stone wall here. And we had this great mystery that popped up. So if you look here on the right side at the top is a photograph we were able to take. We used a painter's pole. You guys know what a painter's pole is. You attach attachment on the end of it and put a camera on it. Slide it in. And we have a timer when we take pictures, and we're able to take pictures inside that space. So this is actually a photograph from inside on the western end of the building. You can see there's spray foam that's been put on for insulation purposes. On this side here on the left, that's actually from the laser scanner. You can also see spray foam on there too. The two red arrows point at the fact that there's a difference between the way the roofs are connected. So there's this short knee wall here. There's no evidence of the knee wall there. For us, we had to figure out the logic behind this, which was really challenging. If you notice here from the point cloud, The distance from the top of the cap plate down to the top of the foam is about 6 inches. If you look on the other side though, there's actually a drawing that George Nakashima did of the other side of the house. He didn't do it on this end, but he did it on that end. So we had some evidence to go from. But if you look at this, here's that same drawing, and I took this piece out and I show it here. If you look at the bottom image here, you can actually see that he marked that roof rafter as a 2x4. And that block that he has placed there isn't much bigger than that 2x4. So there was a piece of blocking put in, but it was a fairly small piece of blocking. If you look here, this is what we had to work with. So obviously you can see that you have the upper sloped roof here and the gable roof on top. The data that you see on top is just from that one scanner going in. Moji said we scanned 66 scans. We only got 2 in that space. We're only able to get 1 space in the crawl space between the ceiling and that shed roof. And that space in there is filled with insulation. So we had very little information to go on. You can see, here's the opening that we went through. One of the things we had to figure out is the logic of how he built this. So here you see the original house with the slope roof, and you obviously see an overhang that overhangs the south side of the building. If you look on the bottom, that overhang is gone, the gable roof is on top. But if you look at the 2 images on the other side, we took our 3D model and placed it on top of the photograph that we took. And you can see what he would have had to have done is remove that overhang in order to raise a short knee wall to be able to build a gable roof on top. What we had to do is we had to figure out the logic here. From that previous image, you probably noticed that he left the tiles in there. And you can actually see the tiles still in that photograph underneath the foam. Top image on the left, we zoomed in very close, and you can see that the corrugated roof rides up over the top of the original tile. And if you look down at the bottom, we gave you an example of that in the 3D model, and you can see that there's a height difference. So there's a height difference between what was the header beam, and he had to actually cut back that roof, so he built this little knee wall on top of that header beam. And the difference between this height and this height is about 4 or 5 inches, which we think is the difference that makes up the reasoning behind that little knee wall that shows on one side that doesn't show on the other. Do we know this for a fact? No. We have no way of knowing because we can't get into that space to be able to get all the data we need. This is part of the process that we go through when we do this type of work. We have to try and figure out some sort of logic behind this thinking. If you look here, you can see the tiles. Mira, I think, showed this exact same picture earlier. These tiles were quite large. He put those tiles only on half the roof. And they were relatively thick. They were probably at least an inch thick. And if you look here, it says the concrete tiles were left in place. And you can see the height here would have been fairly substantial. It would have been 2 or 3 inches in total. But here, the corrugated panels were cut back and he put a knee wall in. And we think that's why we see the difference between here and here. Do we know for sure? No. Forget it. We're gonna accept it as being a possibility. So another interesting thing about that exact same space, again, I tell you, we only had the 2 scans, so we had to work with what we had, is that we noticed these interesting diagonals. So you can see these are the rafters. This is that same cap plate you were looking at before. You can see the header beam up here. But he had these interesting diagonals. If you look at the model that Moji built, there were only 3 of these. Didn't go the full length of the house. It was just on that one eastern end. You can see them all sitting over the top of that corrugated segment. We couldn't figure out the logic of this initially. Then we started looking again at this eastern end of the building, realizing, okay, well, you can see the red arrows point at the ends of the purlins that held up that sloped roof. There's that knee wall that holds up the actual roof above, and I show you down here an original photograph of the image matching those same two purlins. But think through the logic. So when you put the gable roof on, he knew that he had that shed roof sticking up. In order to put the gable on, it's not a perfect balanced gable. The rafters on the north end of the building are thicker rafters. They're 2x6 and they're longer. They're 12'7", whereas on the other side they're only 2x4s, and it's 9'11", so it's about 3 feet difference. So we realized the downward load of the roof, because of the misloading of the roof, it would have wanted to push it over. So if you're looking at the next image down, he did put collar ties in, rafter ties, collar ties, and he put connections between 3 points. But it still would have meant that this little teeny knee wall that I was just talking about would want to push over. So what we think he did was he put those 3 pieces in to create a triangulation, which would guarantee that that roof wouldn't pitch over. And it's interesting because if you look at this third image down, you can see he put these ties in, but he also put these interesting diagonal ones in that are on the other end of the house. He didn't keep them all even. The ones on the western end slope downward. But what we realized is because he still had that shed roof in there with the tiles on, all he had to do was take those rafters and tip them down a little bit, and it would create the triangulation to keep that end of the house stable. And we talk about it all in these drawings. So this kind of information, we figure it out, and then we communicate it. All right, so one of the other complicated parts, you go into the house and you can see what you can see, but there are parts you cannot see. That roof is one of them, and the crawl space is another one. Moji mentioned the crawl space earlier. This is that northern stone wall, and there's this one crawl space that runs along just up against that segment of wall. And you can see this is what we were faced with. It was not a space that we really wanted to crawl into. It's not even a space we think we could have crawled into. I put my foot in here to give you an idea of the size. It's completely spray foam. It's got a lot of spider webs in it. But you'll notice in that bottom image, the red arrow points at plumbing. Crawl space, we think, was probably to try and keep the pipes warm. Makes sense, especially when you look at this. The original house, that south side was open. So the house floated up, and what he did was he built a crawl space to be able to put the plumbing in order to keep the plumbing warm enough. All you have to do is keep it above 32 degrees. So I figured I can put it inside a cabinet, basically, a concrete cabinet, and keep those pipes warm. But the other thing that we thought was interesting as we looked at the historic photographs is that if you look at photograph A here, this is a picture of Mira sitting in her bedroom. And what I've done is I've drawn a green box here and a red box here, and the green box matches this, which is the original historic photograph just blown up. And you'll notice that there's a chimney here. On the other side, this is what we live with today. We can't see anything in there, the chimney's been removed, it's just a cabinet. And if you look at A3, that's from the bedroom on the other side. So there's nothing that would give us evidence of anything ever having been there. So we had to come to some conclusions working from the historic photographs. If you look at photograph B, we have this photograph at the end of the house, and you'll notice that there's a chimney here. And we think that chimney corresponds to this pipe. And we think that this barrel here is probably a kerosene barrel that they used to supply the heater inside the house. If you look at picture C, you can see the plumbing from the bathroom going down into the floor, which would have gone into that crawl space. So this is the ultimate question that we asked ourselves when we worked on this project. Is the home a modernist building with Japanese styling, or is the home a Japanese building with modernist styling? If you look at a building like this, I think people who are architects, people who are builders and designers look at this and realize this is a modernist building, but there's lots of Japanese styling. That crawl space and that chimney, we started thinking maybe he starts to use the logic of traditional Japanese architecture. So in traditional Japanese architecture, and I apologize if my Japanese is not good, I check my pronunciations as best as possible. It's called an irori, which is a charcoal pit that's very traditional in Japanese houses. It's set down into the floor, and they would put charcoal in, and they would heat the pots. But it says here, when traditional open charcoal irori pits fell out of use in the mid-20th century, many Japanese households in cold regions kept the sunken floor structure and began placing portable kerosene heaters in the recess inside instead. So we think what he may have done was to keep that crawl space even warmer. He may have actually set that heater down a little bit into that space to try and heat that void. So one of the things that we obviously do in our field is do a lot of reading to try and figure out tradition, history, things like that. This book here, Japanese House, is a contemporary book. It's actually completely made out of a few chapters of a fairly well-known book called The Japanese House, which ironically, I mean, it just goes to show what kind of rabbit hole those preservationists are. The book was actually written by a man named Heinrich Engel, who was the office administrator for Ernst Neufert, who did Neufert's Architects Data, which you probably a lot of you guys know this book. It's like the international version of the architectural graphic standards. So, and he was somebody who actually went to Bauhaus. So the history of this book connection is quite fascinating to us who do this kind of documentation, since that book is something that people use to understand documentation. So George Nakashima wrote in his book, The Soul of a Tree, he said, in a traditional Japanese house, the proportions have been perfected over many generations. A variation of as little as half an inch in the horizontal can mean a devastating failure. In the same way, one mismatched board in a cabinet can be a disaster. Obviously, he may be speaking about cabinetry, but he may also be speaking about houses. In fact, he may be speaking about his own house. So if you look at this, this gives you the footprint of the whole house, but the light area represents the footprint of the original house. Moji mentioned there was a bedroom put off the side. They extended out here. They also extended off on the western end. And if we look in that same Japanese house book, it talks about tatami mats and how Japanese houses were traditionally dimensioned off tatami mats. So what we did was we took one segment of the structure in the ceiling and measured it. And the measurements that you get here, 37 and 7/8 by 75 and 7/8, matches almost perfectly to a tatami mat. So we got a little suspicious and said, maybe there's a logic here. So we took that exact same spot, took that dimension, and spaced it across the house, and the tatami mats fit perfectly.
Amazing.
So the thing that we thought was really great about it is that we started looking back into that historic book, and there are representations of traditional mat layouts for different types of rooms. And if you take those mat layouts out of that book and match it to the actual rooms in the house, it matches the tatami mats from a traditional Japanese house.
Fine.
So other things that were included in this house that we thought definitely said distinctively this is a Japanese house. This is called Ichibadate, and it says yakasugi. Yakasugi is what you see in the lower picture on the top right. It's the burning on the bottom of the wood. Ichibadate is a process that Japanese go through where they actually carve the post to fit the stone perfectly. So what you have here is a drawing from a traditional Japanese book, and the drawing down here is a drawing that came from a magazine article about this house. And there are actually posts in that house that have this exact same configuration, and we know that because the photograph beside it was actually taken of this house. So we don't think there's any question that this is traditional Ichibadate. And if you look, you can see there's ghosting on the bottom part of that post, which we think matches that yakasugi, which is that burning process on the bottom. This is another one that we thought was really interesting. If you look at the roof of the house, you have the shingles that stick up like this. Now, traditional shingling, when they extend that like that in the United States, it's called a coxcomb. It's oftentimes one-sided. And it traditionally goes one side because they tend to put it on the direction of the prevailing wind currents. But he varied it. He switched it back and forth. So there's this Japanese tradition called Yumi Osea. And if you look at this picture right here, this is from a traditional Japanese Minka house. These features were designed to actually hold the thatch on traditional roofs. But it became so iconic in Japanese Minka architecture that even when they got rid of thatch, they kept that same structure. So we think that George Nakashima may have very consciously made these things stick up like this just to look the way they do as they do in the Japanese Minka house. Another one is the Engawa. The Engawa is the outside porch. If you look on the left-hand side here, this is a temple in Kyoto. And if you look at the middle picture, that's what the house looked like originally once it was completed. It's almost identical. He had this porch, he had this little roof over the top, which is very much the traditional Engawa. Even in the contemporary view that you see further over, that was what happened after the building was extended outward. When it was extended outward, it basically swallowed up this decking area. So what he did is he put another little roof over the top and put another deck out there to capture the same features. And here's another quote from this book. He said, "My grandmother's ancestral home, similar in construction and architecture to the one in which I was staying, was located in Kawasaki across the Tama River from Kamada. It seemed to me that the life and customs in Kamada were of a former age. The house was completely Japanese, with a wooden veranda running around the entire structure." So we think that he's looking back on his own traditions, his own experiences in Japan, and bringing that tradition with him here. Another one is the Genkan. The Genkan is actually the entrance space, and if you go up and visit the house, you'll see this very distinctive entrance. The view on the right-hand side is what George Nakashima's house looked like before they wound up making the modifications that you'll see today. But if you look on the left, this is the Ashigara house in Kanazawa, Japan. And Ashigawa, the Garu, which I looked up, stands for the foot soldiers, which was the lowest rank of samurai. This is a traditional genkan in a Japanese house. It's a space where you walk into, you remove your shoes before you enter the house. And we found it very interesting when we looked up about the genkan. It says here, the vestibule just inside the main entrance to a Japanese house that's called a genkan. Houses built in the traditional Japanese style have a somewhat formal genkan. First, you stand outside and call it a formal greeting to announce your presence. Then you slide open the outside door and walk onto the concrete or stone floor that is at ground level. Someone living in the house will come to the small open room to greet you. If the person invites you inside, remove your shoes, which you would do here, then step up onto the wooden step, which you can see right there, just beyond the mat. Now you can walk into the house to the room reserved for visitors. Finally, which we think is very much distinctly speaking about Japanese architectural traditions, is this post. So if you go in this house, you'll see this post in the living room, and it's kind of in an odd location. It's close to the front door, but it definitely stands out. In Japanese architecture, it's called the Daikoku Bashira. It says here, it's a thick central pillar that holds both structure and symbolic significance. Historically, this post has been a key feature in traditional Japanese homes, particularly minka, which is a vernacular Japanese house. Architecturally, as the thickest and most important pillar, the Daikoku Bashira carries a large portion of the structural load, including the roof and upper floors. Due to its importance, it was traditionally made from strong and durable woods such as selkova, oak, or cherry. In this case, he kept it in its natural form. He didn't carve it down into a square shape. It says symbolically the pillar's name is associated with Daikokuten, one of Japan's 7 gods of fortune and the deity of wealth, agriculture, and the household. It was considered a sacred post, and the embodiment of Daikokuten, believed to be the guardian of the household's well-being and prosperity. The pillar is often situated next to the central sunken hearth, where the family would gather to relax, eat, and stay warm. Its position here reinforces its symbolic role as the heart and guardian of the household. And if we look at that floor plan, the red arrow points at that post, then there's no question that that is a space where they ate, relaxed, and stayed warm. So that's my presentation. I think that one of the things that I think we went into this project back in 2017. Mike Henry was involved in that project as well. We documented this building. We had a student that did his thesis on this building. We came away from the site thinking this is a very modernist site that has these Japanese feelings to it. But we don't have any question now that that house up there is a very, very traditional Japanese house with modernist style.
John, before you leave,
Yeah.
and I don't think, the second to last slide was the furniture plan. Can you just point out that braced wall on either side of
The ones up for the bathroom?
right, that gives lateral
Here?
stability to the whole
That's it.
house? Right. Logic can talk about that. That wall. Go ahead.
Yeah, we discovered those diagonal braces on the one side of the bathroom. And then we had a lot of discussion between me and John and Frank and many people. And then we took advantage of having that remodel. I shared that remodel with Michael as an engineer to see what's that? What's exactly that? Because it wasn't just the diagonal braces on the sides of the bathroom. We also had a chamber on the bottom of the bathroom.
To the chamber under here.
Yeah.
So that crawl space is here, but this chamber extends out further in.
And it is, it is connected to the crawl space. So those braces and also the chamber somehow working together,
Yeah.
right?
To keep the two long walls apart.
Yeah.
It's great.
I'm gonna hand this over to you guys.
I would just like to reinforce what a fantastic opportunity the structures here at Nakashima Woodworker site have been as learning opportunities for students at Penn, as well as students at the Whitaker Graduate Program in Art Conservation. This building had Whitaker students looking at the collections. We had an architecture student from Penn who modeled the natural light falling on the walls and the light intensity falling on the walls from the standpoint of light exposure and the potential risk to any artwork that's here from overexposure to light. We had a Penn student who looked at the canopy at the pool, and we brought in another graduate student from the art conservation program at Winterthur University of Delaware to tag along with us and participate in the observation at the family house, or the family home. So we are so very grateful to Mira and Nakashima woodworker site for giving us those opportunities, because they're important learning opportunities with unique structures that are highly complicated in terms of history and evolution and materials. You don't get many chances. I don't get many chances to work at a place like this, and they don't get many chances to learn from it unless those opportunities have been provided. Yeah. So, full disclosure, I'm an engineer by training. I'm an architect by exam, so those of you who are architects, I'm sorry, I didn't have to take studio. My work focuses, and my teaching focus, on building pathology and how buildings deteriorate as assemblies and as single materials. What are the causal factors? So it's forward thinking, not reactive thinking. It's thinking ahead, what can go wrong, and how do we protect the building. Bill Whitaker talked about endurance. And so what Wendy and I are going to talk about, the conservation assessment, is how do we promote endurance of not only the building, but the collections that are inside the building. The collections being the remnants of the lives of the family and how those stories are told. So the conservation assessment is the first step in that. Thinking about pathologies of building materials and thinking about risks to collections and the building as a primary container for the collections, and how do they work together, and what can we provide in terms of guidance going forward. And an important part of this project is, many times we work together on projects that have been long established as historic sites. So, they're old houses, but long established as historic sites. But this is one that's in transition from recently lived home to an interpreted site. And part of the conservation assessment is to help with that transition.
And to understand that. I think it's been such an honor to be a part of this, partly for very, very personal reasons. I spent my early childhood in Tokyo, and Japanese, strangely enough, was my first language. I do not speak it now, but
Thank you.
yeah, I feel. But at the same time, I've always felt that there's been so much about Japanese culture that has been embedded in my psyche that it's been a real honor to be here. And I agree with you. I think it's a Japanese house with modernist tendencies. Is really what I think it is. I'm a conservator in private practice. I specialize in preventive conservation. How do you prevent the damage from happening? And we'll hear a little bit more about this going forward. And so I think we need to acknowledge the funding that we received for this project. And for those of you, please get out there and advocate for the continuation of funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It's a federal program. It's a very important, it's made a major importance in our cultural heritage protection over the last 30, 40 years. There's another small bit that is personal here. I went to high school with Kevin Nakashima. I'm so sorry. He was a year or two behind me. He was a year or two behind me, but
4 years older.
So I, you know, it's so remarkable to see the photographs because seeing the photographs of Kevin, he looks so much like his dad, you know. So it's a personal thing. So my personal involvement is been very dear to me on this project. Conservation assessments, what are they? What are they? I'm trying to get this. There we go. Go backwards. No? Yes?
Yes.
No, that's right. Okay, conservation assessment, and Michael and I have been doing conservation assessments since 1996. So that gives you a long time, almost 30 years. The Getty Conservation Institute put us together to do a general conservation assessment of the Bardo Museum in Tunis, in Tunisia. And we were sent there together to look at it. How do we translate a methodology to looking at the relationship between collections in a building and the preservation of both? And we were trying to take a tool that had been developed 5 years earlier, or actually 7 years earlier, to make it accessible and usable in developing environments. What we have found in our 30 years of doing conservation assessments, that it is a highly collaborative project. And collaboration between the professionals that have been brought in to do the work, the conservator Michael as a building specialist, engineer, architect, but it's also very much a collaboration with the stewards of that collection and of the building, because you, the stewards, are going to be living and caring for and developing that program going forward from here. We come in for a short period of time, so it's really important to consider the resource and consider the people that are involved with this. So, the assessment process, what is it? Michael and I have developed over the years a real strong sort of ethos of working from the outside in. What is the climate? And you'll hear a bit more about this. What is the environment? What is the situation? What's the geography? What is it that the building that has been constructed does? And then I look at and what's the condition of the building? And then what's the interior like? What are the collections like? What's the vulnerabilities of the collection? What are the capacities of the individuals who are stewarding these collections? So it's a highly collaborative and important process to really get a sense of it, to come up with realistic and achievable recommendations for moving forward.
And that's a key point. That's the interaction with the stewards and the owners of the property. It's not experts dictating what should be done, but it's what can be done and how does it work. And you have to fit with the culture of the institution as well.
So it's a touching base over time throughout that process and then afterwards, and testing out the ideas of what we're doing. We have to consider a variety. I'm lying down on my here, but this is my point.
We look at the history and the significance of the building, understanding the sequence of construction, which has been crucial to understanding what we're looking at when we see the building surfaces. It's what's behind those surfaces. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, the context, the climate, above and below the building. Soils, how building responds to moisture in the soils in the ground below, climate change, and the site itself.
And then I will look at the buildings and the materials that the objects are made of, and how the collections have been used. How, and in this case, what's very important is how were they acquired? What are the influences? I mean, spoke earlier about the Benchon, that relationship between the families. How were these things acquired? How were these items that are in the house made by family members? You know, how did it influence the life? How were the collections used, past, present, and future? And then what are the vulnerabilities and risks of collections from that? So, looking at risks, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but it gives you an idea of the types of risks that we are thinking about. We're thinking about catastrophic risk, which is like fire and flood, but we also think about incremental risks, which have to do with small changes to the materials over time that have been induced by light, pollution, pests, improper temperature, improper relative humidity, water, any number. And sometimes they work together. Sometimes we don't know what's happening until after the fact. So we have to be very cognizant of these issues as a potential damage for these collections. And the interesting thing with, well, it's now we're going on to the building, but the interesting thing here that I think we can say right now is that there are so many different material types, both in the building and in the collections, that all of these, we have to be cognizant of all of the potential risks that can occur.
And this is partly forward thinking. It's not just looking at something that's saying, oh, there's a moth hole in the fabric, and so you must have pests. But it's looking at the fabric and saying, what is it, if it's undamaged, looking at it and saying, what are the potential risks to this, and how do you prevent them going forward? And so the term for that is preventive conservation. And in a way, we're looking at preventive conservation of the building as well.
What? Incorrect. RH? Relative humidity. So it's the moisture content of the air that is. I can define these later if you'd like.
Yeah, so just going forward. So starting with the outside in, I don't expect you to read these or see what we've got here, but this is data driven. A lot of data were collected on the temperature and relative humidity inside the building, as well as knowing what was happening outside the building. That's not the only risk to the collections, but it's one in which we can acquire data and we can understand how the building performs as an enclosure in creating a favorable environment for the collections. It's also one of the exterior vulnerabilities of the building in terms of moisture.
I think it's also important to say that with moisture is a generator of many of contributor and a generator of many of the deterioration risks that we mentioned.
And it may be indirect. It may be favorable to microorganisms or pests that actually do the damage. So you have to think about systemic aspect of deterioration. We also have to look at climate change. And we know that in this particular part of the country, we're going to see more intense and more frequent severe rainstorms. So things like water management around the building so that we don't get too much moisture in the soil, thinking about the timber posts on stone. We don't want the building to have differential settlement because those posts have deteriorated from moisture or insect activity. So it's looking ahead and incorporating issues that we have really good science on what might be happening in the near term, at least the next 10 years. So I like to think this building in terms of bioclimatic design, going back to making a building work with the climate and understanding the climate first, and then situating the building in terms of its direction and its width and its length so that you maximize the benefits of sunlight as well as you negate the benefits of wind. And so what we've got here, when you go up to the building, you'll notice that it's set below the brow of the hill. That's not just something that was instructed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but it also protects the building from wind, the prevailing wind in the north and the low temperatures that come out in the north in the wintertime. It's a solar building. It's a passive solar building in its original form. And this is important. This is where the Penn study on the sequence of construction, the evolution of the building has been informative because we can see how it's changed over time. But initially, it was very much a simple passive solar building relying on all that window area on the south exposure to warm the building and get some light control from the extended eaves. It still has that behavior now, but less intense than when it was all glass. Part of the bioclimatic design is ventilation. And I like to think that on the ventilation side, particularly with the movable screens that you'll see on interior partitions in the long direction of the building, that provided for cross ventilation. But I like to think of George Nakashima being at Golkong and in southeastern India and dealing in an extreme hot, humid environment, and how cross ventilation in that building was so critical. And I was talking with John DeFazio earlier, and I said that I also see that what George learned at Golkong was also informative of what Corbusier did in Chandidar with his museums there. Not just in terms of ventilation, natural ventilation, but also in terms of using concrete as an architectural material. So we have operable Sochi screens, and we also have the Tomigo fixed grids that you'll see on Kevin's bedroom, all for light control and cross ventilation aspects. We have to think about not only the building's behavior in response to the climate, but also how it performs as an enclosure with windows and doors closed and shades drawn. And so we're looking at the solid parts of the envelope and what we can improve there. In the Penn study, knowing what we've got in terms of roof cavities was absolutely critical to understanding the stability, the thermal stability inside the house, because it's not often that we get that kind of layered construction. We didn't know what it was until we had the scans and the drawings that showed us how much of a thermal envelope, how effective it might be, until we were able to see that, as well as there's been discussion of the crawl spaces, and you've seen some of the insulation underneath. Perhaps the only place that we can't make improvement is the panel-clad walls. They appear to be an early mid-century industrial product that was also used on the Eames house, known as a Semesto panel, which has a thin concrete layer and then on each side, and then a treated bagasse material as an insulating material inside. And you can see the evidence of the thin concrete layer here and here, and then there's an applied stucco material over the edge where the bagasse cane fiber is in the center of that material. So there's some commonalities between buildings of similar period. The Eames house in California being built a little bit later than the family home, but also taking advantage of available comparatively inexpensive industrial materials.
If I'm incorrect, correct me, but I believe that bagasse was also used on site because the owner who had constructed in the mid-1940s, this is down in the deep south, selected it as a material because it was fireproofing. You know, he was very concerned about fireproof. So you've got some fire resistance with that bagasse.
What's interesting are the environmental systems. I think you've seen ample evidence of how they've changed over the year. So from an interpretive standpoint and from an improvement standpoint, we're not necessarily wedded to or tied to an existing system as evidence, but we are spatially limited as to what you can insert into this building, particularly for humidity control, relative humidity control.
Cool. So I guess I'm up. Okay, so from the outside in on the collections, I am a firm believer that, particularly in this case, that the building is the largest and perhaps most important artifact that's in the collection. It also demonstrates, it provides the background to tell the stories of the 80 years of occupancy or 75 plus years of occupancy and changes by the family. The importance from my perspective is also the associate, excuse me, the associated and informational value that the arrangement of the materials are within that space. It provides, and it really provides insights into the Nakashima family life. There are so many different types of materials, both fixed and movable. And each, as I said earlier, each of them have different sensitivities and vulnerabilities. So that has to be considered. I mean, here we have a photograph of Mira's mural in her bedroom that we saw in black and white before, so it's delightful to see to be able to show it here. The relationship of the painted mural on the wall to the other objects in the space is very, very important. But there's so much material in the house, and that we really need to think about it. And each of the material, there's so many different vulnerabilities here. There are materials that have vulnerability to light. There are materials that have a lot, like sensitive materials. There are materials that are sensitive to humidity changes, dryness, all of that. And it includes documentation, artwork, books, textiles, garments, everything, ephemera, and even down to the tickets from a concert that Kevin attended when a few years before his passing. So I think it's really important that we have to understand where the sensitivities are and the types of materials and the types of sensitivities that are there. Yes.
Monica, can I just say one thing? I just want y'all to know her point about the objects in the house. I mean, it gives it the spirit. It's amazing to go into this house and see all these things, all these little objects. It's
People
fabulous.
factor.
It's fabulous.
People factor.
It really gives it a sense of lived in.
And that's an important characteristic. So we're gonna, because I know we've got some time constraints here, but the key next slide. So here are some of the key observations that we made. And that the bioclimatic design, as I said, the building itself is an important component or important artifact in the collection. The way it performs, the information that it provides, and the way it was made, that's really a significant aspect of this house and for interpretation. And it also challenges the preservation of the collections inside. So how do we balance that? And that was one of the key questions that I had to grapple with as we were working on this. It's a discernment of what is important and how to preserve what's important for the future. And the assessment, and I think I may have neglected to say, throughout the assessment process, we talked with Mira, we talked with Zoriana, we talked with Dave, and John, to find out what's important as we preserve and as we consider the preservation of the house. It's got so many different layers that we have to consider. We have to honor the experiential authenticity of the assemblage, but we also have to be able to show that we're preserving for the future generations.
And when we talk about experiential authenticity, it's what the visitor feels and sees and how that provides a connection with how the family lived in the house. Not as a static experience, just walking around looking at things, but thinking about what it was like to live, move, and participate as a family together in the house. And that's really important. And I will say about the extent of the collections, I'm old enough to have recently experienced downsizing. And downsizing is not an option.
Because of the associated informational value that's there. But it's also, we are now changing the use. I mean, the foundation is changing the use of the house from an occupied residence to an interpreted site that tells the stories, that provides the background, that provides the context for telling the stories. So it's going to be very critical, next slide, very critical to honor that, but also develop strategies in concert and collaboration with the foundation and the foundation stewards to develop policies that tell us how we're going to use them, how we can care for, how these objects are, and materials and the house are cared for. What's the importance of context? What are the stories that have been told? What are the stories in the future that you want to tell? And to leave it available in the future to tell the stories that we don't know yet, because you are in the process of understanding the stories that go with this. All of the archival work has been so very valuable, and we need to be able to leave space in the preservation for continuing to tell that story. So a number of the important recommendations that we made is to develop a comprehensive conservation management plan that balances both the needs of the building with the needs of the collection. One is not, even though I said the building's the most important part, have to consider both simultaneously, and it integrates it so that any decision that's made for the building has to understand what the needs of the collections are. As you will see when you go into the house, it's a very, very small space. And the visitor will only see a very small, will observe only the surface of the materials that are there. Or the interpretive plan may change so that you can open up a couple of drawers. But because there is so much other materials that are not seen by the visitors, we strongly urge that collections that are not exhibited or not viewed by the visitor, or if they're especially sensitive, that they be placed in a storage location on site. They can be brought out on special occasions. They can be brought out for exhibition, but things that are not generally seen, things that are in the back of the closets, that are in the drawers, that are in the boxes, that are inside of containers, provide ultimate storage that preserves them for future use. And then reduce the quantity of exhibited collections. We're going to ask you to be very, very careful when you walk through the house because it is very, very congested. And it's wonderful because it does give you the sense of what it was like. But if we're going to preserve it for the future, for other visitors, it means being careful about rubbing up against things, not picking things up.
I would say part of what drives the idea of relocating some collections to a different storage area is just because of the catastrophic risks in any institution of having everything in one place. Certainly you have the risk of separation and dissociation, but on the same site, with knowing that you have a combustible building, you have exterior exposures to strong winds and rain, that it does have some prudent value to put some of the collections in a separate storage facility where you can deal with those big catastrophic risks by design, which is harder to deal with the house without changing it radically.
I mean, already you were very careful. I mean, my observation has been is that you've got limited visitation, but I think that that's really we're not gonna try I think Mount Vernon has to have 1 million visitors a year, otherwise they have to lay off their some staff, and that's not. That was generally known, so I'm not telling it's revenue driven, and so I'm not telling tales out of school. However, I think it's really important to be very clear as to what the policies are, who can come, when can they come, and to make sure that there are limitations on how the building is accessed. Already being, encouraging people or asking people to take shoes off when you enter at the game hall is a really good idea. I mean, there's so much that was designed into Japanese architecture that is it's also already preservation minded there. Light was an especially major challenge here because of the bioclimatic designs. Use of the shoji, it's great. It's great. It does help to reduce it. We understand that there is a program now to incorporate ultraviolet radiation control because that's a high energy damage to most organic materials. That is great. And the plan to phase the upgrade to the buildings. This whole project is feeding. I mean, the work that was done at Penn, conservation assessment, the environmental assessment that Michael did, it's all contributed to the plan to make phased improvements, and we applaud you for that.
So, and so things like operating protocols, we're not suggesting that soja panels be placed on some sort of automatic threat mechanism, but that in traditional use, there was a process, a daily process and a seasonal process of how the building was adjusted. And that is an aspect of living in the house that needs to carry through.
And also when you start thinking about budgeting for, because paper or the shoji panels is a light damaged material, very sensitive to light damage. I've seen a couple here where that little finger pokes through. I think it's really important to put into a regular budget process these ongoing maintenance, not forgetting about it, continuing with this. And that would go into a conservation management plan.
So just once again, thanks. And we landed a little early, so we have time for questions for the entire team.
Other question?
Do you have questions?
Excellent. Oh, okay, I'll just project. So we're taught in preservation school that there's sort of an Eastern and Western, not necessarily versus, but slightly different approaches to conservation. Eastern being more lenient and honoring of craft work and the sort of replacement as preservation and the process of replacement of members or even renewal as being part and parcel of preservation. So this being a Japanese house with modern styling, do you feel like in your approach to your conservation recommendations you could leverage that concept and play with it?
I think that's an excellent question. I'll let John weigh in on that, but I think that's going to come out of his conservation management.
I think it probably has to.
Yeah.
Because that's really critical.
It was designed into the building. It
Yeah.
was designed into the building, and the ongoing preservation of these operational elements is a very important component.
Yeah, especially since it's an active woodworking site, then you can sort of continue that, the guild system from Japan that I understand is mostly still intact, renewal, right?
Yeah, I think, with our program too, you understand this as well as the rest of us in preservation, but authenticity has different ways of thinking. Michael and Wendy were talking about experiential authenticity. So there's physical authenticity, which is the authenticity of the material. Preservationists can sometimes get a little too hung up on that. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not against it. I'm a big supporter, but I do preservation. But there's also philosophical Philosophical authenticity speaks about the philosophy behind how the building came into existence, how the people choose to maintain the site. And if the philosophical authenticity on this house speaks to that idea of replacement, then I would certainly encourage it.
And it speaks to the culture of the site and the culture of other things that take place on the site and the philosophy of the institution itself. And so we can't be dogmatic about it, prescribed. We have to understand all of those things before we arrive at the recommendation.
And it's another reason why we have to be really cognizant of all the materials that are in the house, the technology of how things were put together, so that the stewards, the plans can proceed to make the best decision with all of the information that's available.
Yeah, what strikes me about this is that we're at a living site, and until really recently, a living building, a lived-in building, as distinct from a historic living site where they're recreating things. This is being created in the present, and that's a big distinction that going forward, I think, has to be addressed.
Yes, good question.
To that point of you're walking into something that was recently flipped and it's like you're looking at a collection over 80 years. We're thinking about preserving the collection. How do you give a sense of living there over time? Because you're not seeing what it was like 80 years ago. I mean, I understand in terms of the models and stuff, but for the building, you can give that sense. How do you think about that in terms of the collection?
Some of that is an interpretation plan, is to have a very clearly articulated interpretation plan and perhaps offer different types of interpretation. I mean, this gets into sort of museological approaches because the history of the family is so important, and I think that's the groundwork that's there, and then to talk from that about what were someone, just like the photographs that we saw, what was it like for Mira to live there as a child? What was it like as it was added in, and with Kevin joining the family?
And I'll turn this to John, but I think we've got the bone. John and the team from Penn have the bones of, I don't want to say animation, but
I mean, we can certainly do that. I think that I think one of the things that's important to think about is so in preservation we oftentimes talk about period of significance. Period of significance is oftentimes very easy to define. You can take a historic building, it's gone through a lot of changes, but there was one person that lived there who was very, very important to our culture, history, things like that. You can say the period of significance was for that individual, which works, but at the same time it erases the past and it erases the time afterwards. I think one of the beauties of a house like this is that the period of significance is the whole period. This house has never not been part of the Nakashima narrative, which means part of the beauty of it is seeing the layers. It's about seeing all of the evidence of change over time. I mean, you can clearly see George Nakashima in there without question. The furniture stands out. It's absolutely gorgeous. But it's amazing because when we walked in there, I mean, Mira's paintings on the wall are fantastic. And even something as unusual as Kevin's knife collection, which was, it was just part of who he was. And to me, that's one of the great beauties of this house, is that you've got this period of significance that's very long, and it's several different people. That's part of the wonder of it.
Can I add a note from the peanut gallery?
Yes, please.
One of the things I came to appreciate about the house was at a point in time it served as a showroom for the business before there were other spaces, and fairly quickly they were adding spaces in order to host, engage potential clients, and to serve that side of the business. At some point it was enough already. This needs to be the regular family house. So it is the one place on the site that for many, many decades was not a place where visitors went into. And it was a place of privacy. Maybe close friends were part of the group that got in there, but it's an important, I think, value that recognizes they needed their own private space to live in, to engage in.
And I think to that end, that's where the issue of development of policies comes in. Management policies, site management policies, and access and use policies are so important. And I know that you're working on them, or that they have been worked on, and I think that Zoriana has been instrumental, and now with Lauren working there, and Dave, and with Mira's input, I think that's all so very important. Mira, you look like you had something to say.
Yeah,
Expecting watching you.
thank you. Thank you so much for all your work and your presentations today. I learned so much about the house. Didn't pay attention to what was going on. I just lived there, and just wanted to give you an update. We have started doing better temperature insulation. We're in the process of changing out all of the old single pane glass. So we have ordered special sized insulated glass and are slowly replacing them in the original frames. Sometimes we had to modify the frames a little bit so they work. So we're doing that. We're also upgrading the heating system because it was not working very well anyway. So we're working on the heating system, which incorporates a humidity control, which it didn't have before. And there is existing ductwork already, so I hope we're going to be able to use that. And as far as history goes, I have to thank Zoriana when she first came in and cleaned up all of my brother's stuff, because he was a collector. And the entire front room was full of karate magazines and DVDs, and bless her heart, she cleaned them all up and found new homes for everything. So I really appreciate that. We've also gone through, it's really interesting, when my parents both died, let me see, go back. When the big bedroom was built on the south end, that was when my brother was born, or because my brother was born, and there wasn't room for both of us, and it was one little bedroom. So I got the big bedroom down on the south side, and then when I left home, my brother got that room. And then when my parents died, he moved back upstairs into the back bedroom, which had been my parents'. So there are these layers of occupation as well as layers of history in that house, some of which are still intact. We went in the back room, which had been my parents' room, and after my brother passed, and cleaned out a large amount of stuff, found one drawer that was intact from my father's time. It had the clothing that he had brought back from India in the 1930s. It was still there, and it was still almost wearable. And then in the closet, there are still dresses that my mother designed and made from fabrics they collected in different places, like India and Japan and so forth. She designed and made herself. So I don't know what to do with all that kind of stuff. Don't want to throw it out.
No, you do not want to throw it out. I think by properly storing it and bringing it out on special occasions, for an event, for an exhibition, you have an exhibit space here.
Yes.
You could do something like that. Come up with creative and new ways of presenting the materials with, but in the rest of the time they are preserved so that you have access to them in the future.
Yeah, we're in the process. We have to renovate the garage, which is not really attached, but it's right next to the family house. We're trying to include that in grant money so we can upgrade that. We were thinking of changing part of that into archival storage, but we haven't done anything yet. So hopefully that would accommodate part of our archives. So slowly.
Well, I think some of this has to do with capacity. What is capable now with your resources, with your human resources, with your financial resources? You're still running a business here, and so I think that laying the groundwork for moving on in the future and making these incremental changes is so valuable. Michael often will talk about what a colleague who's now retired, but she was head of collections and historic resources at the UK National Trust. She would talk about slow conservation, so slow preservation, thinking through the decisions that you're making and incorporating what you can. What's the priority now? What can you afford to do now? Document, document, document throughout that process. And so you've got a good groundwork here.
Well, I think that's pretty much our process too. We have one builder named Johnny Fresco who's been with us for years. He's worked on almost every building. I think might have even helped build this building. So he's familiar with Nakashima architecture and the way things work. And he's already been working on some of the preservation and will probably continue to do so at a fairly slow pace. But yeah, I don't know if we have a totally organized plan, but we'll try to keep you informed of what's been going on. But I know for one thing, I think we're almost done with insulating, changing the single pane to insulated glass. And if there are any more urgent recommendations, please let us know. But I didn't mean to take over this. Does anybody have more questions? I wanted to thank John Lutz too for where. John Lutz, are you still here?
He ran away immediately as he said his name.
For managing all of our work in the house and on the rest of the property as well. And there is Johnny Fresco is our builder. He's a one-man operation. He's been able to fix almost everything that needs fixing. So anyway, there were questions. So I pass this back to you, Wendy.
Sure.
Yep, but John?
Yeah, I'd like to, well, first of all, I want to thank the entire preservation group here for a wonderful presentation and kind of showing all the different layers and history of the house. It's a very modest house, but you kind of show that no house really is a modest house when you kind of really analyze what you're doing. And also, I guess the question is kind of multifaceted. The first one, well, you know, at the Raymond Farm, we are also going through preservation issues and how to, what led to being preserve a house and such. It's also part of a larger question of, and I would like to bring John to address this, is we're in this new era of preserving modern houses, which often got their power from their newness, their uniqueness. They're often built very modestly. George is an extraordinary architect, and every project is literally an experiment in different ways and in different aspects. This is very new. Preservation usually would depend on history and the technology of the age being applied, but here we have like really inventive, exploratory designs. So that's one set of issues. In Japanese culture, preservation is a new idea. Maybe within a family, a house getting handed down from generation to generation would happen. But usually, when people a house is thought as a temporary thing, almost more like furniture than it is a permanent thing. And a lot of the Raymond projects that are back in Japan either have been demolished or threatened to be demolished because the land that is there is much more valuable than the house, and there's not such an attachment to history. So all this is really interesting to me because I think actually we're entering in the new era of preservation. Preservation, I guess, could be dated back in America to 1968 in the Preservation Acts to save historic structures. But now we're talking about the families, the history, and for a much more modest proportion house. The project, this house certainly isn't monumental, but it's deeply significant. And it's a different way of thinking about preservation. So if you could kind of touch upon those different issues about now that we're in this modern, postmodern, whatever we are now era, of the ideas of preservation and the direction of it, because it's much more interesting. It's a deep curation rather than the artifact. It goes much more into the life of these things and how we relate to them and the stories they tell.
With modern houses, there's an interesting issue that we have between the building and the collections. So parallel property is the Charles and Ray Eames house in California, which I've had the good fortune to consult on for Getty and the Eames Foundation, and get not unlike, just like the Nakashima home, it contains all this material. Charles and Ray Eames collected all this stuff, little objects, and they're all out on the tables. And so, as distinct to Mount Vernon, where they have to reconstruct what was there or reassemble what was there. So modern houses, regardless of size, sorry, I think like an engineer, the density of material in the house, numeric density of material in the house is much greater than we have in your 18th, 19th century historic house museum. So that's a really big challenge. I think that for any house, modern or historic, we have to, the big thing that we're up against is climate change and the implications for conservation for the building and the collections due to climate change. The Eames house, the experiential authenticity of the Eames house is when the windows are open and the floor to ceiling draperies are moving in the breeze from the Pacific Ocean. Now you talk about threat-laden air. You're dealing with saline particulates, you're dealing with relative humidity that can't be controlled, and then you have to think about fire and smoke. How do we provide that experiential authenticity of being in there and seeing the movement of light and shadow across the floor and the furnishings in this volumetric space? We have light play in the Nakashima Family Home, recognizing that light itself is damaging, and how do we manage that? So climate change for any of these buildings is probably an overriding factor equal to just the difference between modern buildings and historic buildings. And I don't know if I addressed your question or just made it worse.
I just want to add something. I think one of the things that fascinated me the most when I got into preservation is that preservation, the perception of preservation is everything is old, including the business itself. Preservation is evolving. That's the beauty of preservation. I mean, we tell our students preservation is not about stopping change, it's about managing change. And I think one of the things that fascinates me about studying the history of preservation is that when it really got a foothold in the United States, early on it was about saving really old things. I mean, nothing in the United States is really old, but it was about saving really old things. Now we have this sort of unique challenge of saving things that are old within the lifetime of people that are still alive. Mm-hmm. And I think what that is doing is it's giving us an ability to look at replacement as not being antithetical to good preservation. I mean, people who lived in this house not that long ago were replacing things. And the idea that we could continue to do that is a very different way about thinking about preservation that I don't think was something that preservation was really all about when it got its foothold. I think the other thing that's challenging is that modernist houses, and this is definitely becoming an issue with newer and newer buildings, is that they're being built out of what we sometimes refer to as supernatural materials. Mm-hmm. It's stuff that's not easy to replace. It's not easy to fix. It's not easy to conserve because it's made out of this really sort of weird material like melamine. I mean, God forbid that at some time we're going to be conserving a bunch of IKEA furniture, but I mean, you know what IKEA furniture is made out of. It's stuff that's just not fixable in the way that sort of traditional houses are. And so I think that's forcing us to change the way we think about preservation.
And there are also materials that we don't know their deterioration processes. We don't know how their longevity. We don't know how they're going to respond in conditions. And I think we're going from my perspective. I mean, yes, I'm not an architect. I'm a conservator. My perspective is we've stopped pushing towards putting something inside of a bell jar to now being much more interested in telling the complete stories. I mean, a lot of the pushing things in the bell jar was specific towards a certain class, a certain level of people and certain demographic. And now we are telling the stories that make this site come to life. You had a question, and I didn't want to have.
It was more on like, so what would what would your father would want his legacy to be as it pertains to how he left, you know, how he lived his life and the way he wanted his items to be displayed. I was just curious. Perhaps it's common knowledge, but I personally do not know. Like, what would he say to all this discussion and deep thinking, subject matter experts on how to display his life, you know? That's a good question.
Good question.
Thank you.
I don't know what he
Clearest
would
mind
thought.
What would he say?
I really don't know. I don't think his version of aesthetics was necessarily, you know, thinking of permanency. There's a quality of Japanese aesthetic which is impermanent, and that's what it's in. You know, it's sort of rooted in Zen Buddhism. Nothing is forever, and so it really doesn't matter. But to the rest of us, it matters. But very good question.